There are places on this earth where the ground itself refuses to forget. Places where the stones carry the memory of something so violent, so unnatural, that thousands of years have not been enough to erase the evidence. You can stand on a windswept hilltop in the north of Scotland, on a plateau where the heather bends low against the cold, and you can run your fingers along a wall that was never supposed to exist. The stone beneath your hand is not stone in the way you understand stone. It has been transformed, it has been melted, it has been fused into a dark, glassy, slag-like mass that shimmers faintly under a grey sky, and it does so in defiance of every reasonable explanation for how such a thing could occur here, on this hilltop in this remote corner of the ancient world. The hill is called Tapper Noth. It rises above the parish of Rhynie in Aberdeenshire, a solitary summit crowned by the shattered remains of a great enclosure, a hill fort that once looked out across the rolling farmland of the northeast. Its walls trace an oval nearly 100 metres long and 30 metres across at the very top, and beneath that summit enclosure sprawls a lower settlement whose full extent has only recently begun to reveal itself to modern archaeology. Radiocarbon evidence places construction phases here between the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, though the stone fortification at the apex is often associated with the late first millennium before it, a site that has been shaped, unshaped, and reshaped by human hands across more than 1,000 years. But it is not the layout of Tapper Noth that draws visitors up its long, punishing slope. It is not the view, nor the archaeology, nor the ghost of the vanished Pictish community that once laboured in its shadow. It is the wall itself, or rather, what the wall has become. Because sections of that rampart, which once stood as a defensive perimeter of piled stone and timber, have been reduced to something that looks less like masonry and more like the frozen residue of a foundry. The rock has run together like wax. Individual stones have lost their edges, their boundaries, their identity as discrete objects, and merged into a single continuous flow of dark glass. There are places where the surface catches the light and gives back a dull, oily gleam, as though the hill itself had once wept molten stone and then, at some unknown moment, had been ordered to stop. Imagine for a moment what it takes to do that to rock, not to scorch it, not to blacken it, not to crack it or split it or char its surface, to melt it, to reduce dense pelit and calc-silicate, the tough ancient lithologies of the Scottish Highlands, into a molten mass that then cools into amorphous glass. The temperatures required for such a transformation are not incidental. They are not achievable by accident. Laboratory replication of this effect demands sustained heat between 1000 and 1300 degrees Celsius, held long enough and with sufficient uniformity to overwhelm the crystalline structure of the mineral itself. That is a temperature range that lies well beyond what any known ancient bonfire could produce. It exceeds the operating temperatures of the finest Iron Age metallurgical furnaces. It sits above the reach of siege fires stacked with the driest wood and fanned by the hardest wind. And yet, here it is, on a hilltop in Aberdeenshire, on a windswept ridge above the barley fields, present, tangible, undeniable. A geologist can walk that ridge and confirm what the eye already suspects. She can lay a palm flat against the fused surface and feel the vitreous smoothness where mineral crystals used to be. She can point to the cavities where wooden beams once ran through the rampart, now preserved only as ghostly casts within the glass, hollow reminders of a lattice of timber that must have burned at the heart of whatever inferno consumed this place. She can note the way the melt is concentrated on certain sections of the outer face, as though the heat had been directional, as though something had swept along the line of the wall and touched down where it chose. And she can tell you, without ornament, without theatrical pause, that the numbers do not add up, that we cannot easily explain, using the tools available to any pre-industrial society, how the temperature was reached, how it was sustained, and why it was applied here. This is the wall that should not exist. The scholarly literature has circled this problem for generations, and consensus has proven maddeningly elusive. Some researchers argue that the vitrification of Tapa Nóth and its cousins was a deliberate act, a ritual closure, a ceremonial destruction, a symbolic burning of a place that had come to the end of its purpose in the eyes of its inhabitants. Others suggest something more prosaic, if no less mysterious, that these were timber-laced walls, that the wooden beams inside the ramparts were set alight by accident or by enemy hand, and that when they burned they created something like kiln conditions, sealing in the heat and forcing it deeper into the stone. Yet as soon as one attempts to test that hypothesis in the field, the difficulty becomes apparent. Experimental archaeology has again and again come up short. The fuel loads required are enormous. The sustained temperatures needed are punishing. The volcanologist Fabian Wadsworth, examining the evidence of preserved timber casts within the glassy mass, has argued that the burning was indeed a destructive event, and yet, as he and others have been forced to concede, the sheer effort required to achieve such temperatures remains a point of intense archaeological debate. Nothing about it is easy. Nothing about it fits comfortably into the standard narrative of what pre-modern people, working with pre-modern means, could reasonably have accomplished. There is a further wrinkle, one that dissolves the most seductive theory of all. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Romantic antiquarians looked at these fused ramparts and proposed a wonderfully simple answer. The ancients, they said, had discovered a technique of strengthening their walls by melting the stone together. It was a kind of prehistoric masonry chemistry, a lost art of the Celts, a hidden ingenuity of the northern tribes. It was a story so appealing, so satisfying, that it endured for well over a century in popular imagination. But modern analysis has quietly and firmly buried it. Vitrification does not strengthen a wall, it weakens it. The fused mass becomes brittle, the internal structure compromised, the load-bearing capacity diminished. Whatever purpose the burning served, it was not construction, it was not craft, it was destruction, or something we do not yet have the language to name. And so we're left standing on a Scottish hilltop with an artifact whose existence demands an explanation, and whose every explanation runs into a wall of its own. The wind cuts along the ridge. Ravens turn in the grey air overhead. Somewhere far below, a tractor moves slowly across a distant field, and the glassy stone waits, silent, indifferent, holding its secret as it has held it for 2,000 years and more. What happened here? What force was capable of pouring so much heat into a rampart of local rock that the crystalline order of the mineral itself broke down and reformed as glass? And, the question that will drive everything that follows, why does the same phenomenon, the same signature of impossible temperature, appear on every inhabited continent of the Earth? To ask that question honestly, we must first give the phenomenon a name. We must anchor ourselves in the vocabulary of science before we drift into the vocabulary of speculation. The word is vitrification. It comes from the Latin vitrum, meaning glass, and it describes a very specific physical transformation, the conversion of mineral matter from a crystalline solid into a non-crystalline, glass-like amorphous solid through the application of extreme heat, followed by cooling at a rate rapid enough to bypass the reformation of the original crystal lattice. When silica-rich rock is heated to the molten state and then cooled quickly, its atoms do not have time to arrange themselves back into their patient geometric patterns. They are frozen in disarray. They become glass. This is the same fundamental process by which sand becomes window pane, by which volcanic melt becomes obsidian, by which a foundry produces slag. The chemistry is not obscure. The chemistry is, in fact, elegantly understood. What is not understood is how the necessary conditions arose on a Scottish hilltop, or on a Peruvian mountainside, or in the streets of a Bronze Age Indian city, or across the sand-swept plains of the Sahara. Because those conditions are not trivial, to vitrified dense rampart stone, the kind of pelit and calcsilicate and granite fragments that make up the walls of the Highland forts, the temperature must climb into a specific band. Sustained heat between roughly 1000 and 1250 degrees Celsius is the minimum threshold. Anything lower and you get scorch, you get soot, you get spalling and thermal fracture and cracked stones, but you do not get flow, you do not get melt, you do not get the amorphous glass that defines true vitrification. And that threshold is not a moment, it is not a flash, it is a duration. The heat must linger, the rock must soak. Silica content matters, cooling rate matters. The intimate interaction between fuel, oxygen, insulation, and geometry all matter, and each must fall within a narrow range of possibility if the transformation is to complete itself. Consider, for comparison, what ancient societies were actually capable of. A wildfire moving through a landscape of gorse and heather might raise surface temperatures to something on the order of 800 degrees Celsius at its most intense, impressive, dangerous, capable of killing every living thing in its path, but simply not hot enough. A traditional wood-stacked bonfire, even a very large one, tends to peak around 900 degrees Celsius at its core, and only briefly, and only under ideal conditions of dryness and airflow. The metallurgical furnaces of the Iron Age, purpose-built with clay linings and forced draft from bellows, could reach higher, sometimes flirting with the lower edge of the vitrification range, sometimes edging past it in isolated pockets. But their output was measured in kilograms of bloom iron, not in tons of melted rampart. To scale that heat up, to apply it not to a fist-sized nodule of ore, but to a length of wall, to sustain it for the hours or perhaps days required to fully vitrify the mass, is a task that no reasonable model of ancient technology can easily produce. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh, along with colleagues elsewhere, have circled this problem for decades. Their conclusion, delivered in the cool prose of the peer-reviewed literature, is quietly damning to the easy explanations. Simply having a very large fire close to an appropriate stone face they have found will not easily vitrify the rock. The heat does not soak deep enough. The temperature does not climb high enough. Open flames rise. Their energy escapes upward. Even a substantial pyre banked against a wall and fed continuously tends to peak at surface temperatures far below the threshold required for true stone fusion. Something else has to be happening. Some additional mechanism of insulation, of oxygen control, of thermal concentration has to be in play. And it is here that the timber lacing hypothesis emerges. The idea that if the walls themselves contained wood, and if that wood ignited in a specific geometry, the collapsing structure could theoretically trap the heat, enclose it, and force it downward and inward into the stone. Some researchers argue that this is enough. Others maintain that even under the most favourable conditions imaginable, the energy budget still does not close. That the required temperatures, applied to the required volume, held for the required duration, remain a genuine scientific anomaly. This is what makes the phenomenon so unsettling to the modern eye. It is not that vitrification is impossible. Human beings have been making glass deliberately and skillfully for thousands of years. It is that vitrification on this scale, in this context, using nothing more than the materials and methods available to Iron Age farmers on a Scottish hilltop, is exceedingly difficult to reproduce even under laboratory conditions. Every attempt, every reconstruction, every controlled burn has fallen measurably short. The rigor of the physics is what elevates these sites from curiosity to enigma. Without that rigor, one might wave a hand and speak vaguely of great fires. With it, one is forced to ask harder questions. What kind of fire? Fed by what fuel? Configured how? And, most persistently, why has no living technique, no oral tradition, no clear historical record of the method survived, if the method was indeed the product of deliberate human effort? The physical baseline, once established, transforms the way one looks at the evidence. It refuses the comforting suggestion that these are simply the scars of ordinary destruction. It insists that whatever occurred at Tapo Noth and at its many companions across the highlands and beyond was extraordinary in the strict thermodynamic sense of the word. It required an energy source, and it required an energy delivery that press against the outer limits of what pre-industrial societies are believed to have possessed. And that in turn is what makes it worthwhile to look further, to follow the phenomenon across geography and across time, to ask whether the pattern on this hilltop is unique, or whether it belongs to a larger and stranger story that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. To begin that larger story, one need not leave Scotland, because Tapo Noth is not alone. It is one of perhaps 60 to 70 identified vitrified sites scattered across the highlands and islands, a cluster of anomalies so dense that Scotland has long served, in the archaeological literature, as the effective home base of the vitrified fort mystery. To walk from site to site is to walk through a slow catalogue of impossibility. The forts do not cluster around any single geological feature. They do not follow any single defensive logic. They are perched on ridges, on promontories, on isolated hills, guarding valleys and rivers and stretches of coast. What they share is the signature of the burning, the glassy mass, the fused stone, the ghostly casts of vanished timbers, and a chronological window that stretches roughly from 700 years before the Common Era to about 400 years after it. 1,000-year span. 1,000 years in which, again and again, the walls of Iron Age Scotland were subjected to temperatures that should have been beyond the reach of the people living behind them. Consider Dun Mac Snearchan on the western coast, its rampart running along a low ridge overlooking Loch Linnhe, its stones fused in patches that draw the eye even beneath the moss and the turf. Consider Craig Fadrig near Inverness, its enclosure crowning a wooded hill above the Bowley Firth, its walls carrying the same telltale marks of extreme heat. Consider Finnavon in Angus, sprawling along a low ridge in the fertile eastern lowlands, its long rampart still preserving the outlines of a defensive perimeter, now bonded into a glassy skin. Consider dozens more, less famous, less studied, tucked into corners of the map that only local farmers and hardened walkers ever visit. Each carries the same story, each poses the same question, and each, in the aggregate, transforms what might otherwise be dismissed as a curious local anomaly into something that begins to look like a pattern. It was the archaeologist Ian Ralston, working through the 1970s and delivering a landmark survey in 1986, who first drew the class together with rigour. Ralston mapped the sites, examined their construction, and demonstrated that the vitrification consistently targets the outer face of ramparts that were built with internal timber lacing. That construction technique, a lattice of horizontal wooden beams running through the stone core of the wall, is not unique to Scotland. It appears across Iron Age Europe under a variety of names, of which the most familiar is the Gaulish Murus Gallicus described by Julius Caesar. In the Scottish case, however, the timber-laced walls have suffered a fate that their continental cousins have on the whole escaped. They have been burned to the point of melt. Ralston's careful documentation established that the vitrification was not incidental damage but a systematic feature, that certain sections, certain faces, certain zones of the ramparts had been subjected to heat so severe and so sustained that the local rock had crossed the threshold from crystalline to amorphous, from stone to glass. His work anchored the modern debate. It gave the phenomenon its scholarly spine, and it gave rise to the hypothesis that has dominated academic discussion ever since, that the fires burned within the walls themselves, that the timber lacing, when ignited, acted as an internal fuel bed, that the collapsing stone falling inward under gravity and the weakening of its wooden supports may have created a kind of accidental kiln, trapping the heat, insulating the burn, driving the temperatures upward as the oxygen was drawn through gaps and cracks in the collapsing rampart. It is an ingenious idea. It has the merit of using only the materials known to have been present. It requires no exotic technology, no lost art, no unnamed cause. And on paper at least, it offers a mechanism by which ordinary combustion might, in unusual circumstances, achieve extraordinary results. Yet from the moment the hypothesis was articulated, it has been dogged by a stubborn empirical problem. It does not, on the evidence, work. The attempts to test it are almost as old as the modern study of the sites. In the 1930s, the great Australian-born archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, one of the founders of prehistoric European archaeology as a serious discipline, teamed with the engineer Wallace Thornycroft to build a small model rampart on a Scottish hillside and set it alight. They constructed a section of stone wall with timber lacing, piled it with brushwood and logs, and applied fire under conditions as favourable as they could arrange. The result was disappointing. There was scorching, there was cracking, there was, in isolated places, some limited melting where fuel had concentrated, and the geometry happened to be right. But there was nothing like the extensive, deeply fused glassy mass observed in the ancient sites. The experiment was a partial success at best, and its lessons were sobering. That even with the deliberate effort to reproduce the effect, using the presumed materials of the original builders, the full transformation eluded them. 4.5 decades later, in the summer of 1980, Ian Ralston himself undertook a further attempt. Working with the production team of the television series Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, he built a larger and more carefully engineered replica rampart and subjected it to a controlled burn. Again the fire raged. Again the stone was scorched. Again there was some melting, some flow, some evidence that the mechanism was at least in principle capable of producing vitrification. And again the result fell short of the extensive fusion documented at the original forts. Later attempts by other researchers, including Youngblood and collaborators, have produced similar outcomes. Fires can vitrify stone, but only in small, isolated patches, and only under conditions of extraordinary fuel input. To generate the scale of melt observed at Tapernoth, at Finnavon, at Craig Fadries, at dozens of other sites, to produce not a scorched patch but a fused mass running along whole sections of wall, has proven so far beyond the ability of experimental archaeology to demonstrate. That failure is not proof that the timber lacing hypothesis is wrong. Absence of experimental replication is not in itself evidence of impossibility. There may be conditions of wind, of moisture, of fuel arrangement, of rampart geometry that have simply not been recreated in any of the attempts made so far. The ancient builders, if they were indeed the agents of the burning, may have known things about the process that we have not yet rediscovered, and it must be acknowledged, honestly and openly, that the mainstream of Scottish archaeology continues, on balance, to favour some version of the internal fire model, usually as a destructive event, sometimes ritual, sometimes military, sometimes both. As Ralston himself has observed, the evidence remains ambiguous, and the exact mechanism, along with the intent behind these glass castles, endures as one of the most stubborn puzzles in Northern European prehistory. But ambiguity cuts both ways. When repeated experiments over nearly a century of serious effort have failed to fully reproduce a phenomenon under conditions matching the presumed causal mechanism, a careful mind is entitled to ask whether the mechanism has been correctly identified, whether some element is missing, whether the story of what happened on these hilltops is quite as straightforward as the current textbook account would suggest. Because if it were straightforward, one would expect the replication to be routine. One would expect a controlled burn to yield, at least sometimes, a wall of melted stone. And that is precisely what has not happened. The strangeness of Scotland's glass castles, then, is not simply that they exist. It is that they exist in numbers, 60, 70 sites, perhaps more, scattered across a landscape roughly the size of a modest European nation, and that despite decades of careful experimental work, no one has yet convincingly reproduced them. They are a class of archaeological monument that we can identify, catalogue, radiocarbon date, and describe in exquisite mineralogical detail, but whose central defining feature, the vitrification itself, we cannot make. Not really, not at scale, not the way it was made, whether by design or by disaster, on the ridges of the Highlands 2,000 years ago and more. Stand once more on the summit of Tapornoth, look out across the fields of Aberdeenshire. Follow with your eye the low line of hills that stretches toward the Cairngorms, and try to imagine, in the long dusk of an Iron Age evening, what the moment of the burning must have looked like from a distance. A crown of fire on a distant summit, brighter than any signal beacon, sustained hour after hour, glowing white where the rock itself began to run. Whoever saw it, and someone surely must have seen it, would have carried the memory home, would have told the story, would have named the night the hill had burned, and yet the record we have preserved, in stone and in glass, and in the ghostly hollows where timbers used to lie, is silent on the cause. It shows us what happened. It refuses to tell us why. And this is only Scotland. This is only the beginning. Because if Tapornoth were the sole example, if the phenomenon began and ended on the ridges of the Highlands, one might file it away as a local anomaly, a peculiarity of a peculiar people in a peculiar place. But the same signature of impossible heat, the same glassy fusion, the same defiance of any ordinary explanation, appears again and again in places that had no contact with Iron Age Scotland, no cultural link, no shared technology, no reason on earth to produce the same effect by the same means. It appears on a mountainside in the Andes. It appears in the streets of a lost city on the Indus Plain. It appears in the shattered capital of a vanished empire on the Anatolian plateau. And it appears, in perhaps its most spectacular form of all, spread across hundreds of kilometres of desert in the heart of the Sahara. The wall on the Scottish hilltop is not an ending. It is a doorway, and through that doorway, the mystery only deepens. Before stepping through that doorway, however, one must linger a moment longer on the experiments themselves, because the story of what men have tried to do, and failed to do, on Scottish hillsides in the 20th century deserves closer inspection. It is easy, in the summary, to say that the replications fell short. It is another thing entirely to walk through the details of those attempts, to feel the ambition of the men who staged them, to appreciate the timber they hauled and the fires they fed and the results they carried away, and to understand just how narrow the gap seemed, and yet how absolute it turned out to be. The year was 1937. Europe was in the last uneasy summer before catastrophe, and on a patch of ground at Plene Colliery in Stirlingshire, two men were preparing to build a wall in order to burn it down. V. Gordon Child, one of the towering figures of 20th century archaeology, and Wallace Thornycroft, an engineer with a practical bent and access to the materials of an industrial landscape, had decided that the mystery of the vitrified forts could not be resolved from a study chair. It had to be tested. It had to be lit. The wall they raised was modest by the standards of the ancient ramparts, 12 feet long, 6 feet high, but it was constructed with careful attention to the model that had come to dominate the literature: basalt rubble, chosen for its resemblance to the stones of the northern forts, pit props from the colliery, standing in for the massive oak beams that were presumed to have laced the walls of the Iron Age, a structure in miniature of what a timber-laced rampart was thought to have been. And then, when the wall was ready and the weather was right, they set it alight. The fire, by all accounts, was enormous. Timber blazed, rubble glowed. The heat that rose from that small experimental wall was, for a modest structure, prodigious, enough to scorch the surrounding ground, enough to force the observers back, enough to feed for hours on the fuel that had been packed carefully around the stones. And when at last the flames subsided and the ashes cooled, Child and Thornycroft went to examine what they had made. The results were tantalizing. There were places on the wall where the basalt had partially fused. There were patches of glassy slag, drips of melted mineral, edges that had softened and run. It was not nothing. It was, in a sense, a proof of concept, evidence that a burning timber-laced wall could, under some conditions, begin to vitrify. But it was not vitrification as the archaeological record showed it. It was not the deep, uniform structural fusion that turned entire rampart cores at Finnavon and Tapernoth into blocks of monolithic glass. It was surface effect. It was hint and suggestion. It was the beginning of the transformation, but not the transformation itself. And to achieve even that, they had needed an audacious quantity of timber, arranged with a deliberateness that pushed at the edges of plausibility for an ancient defensive structure. Undeterred, or perhaps precisely because the Plene experiment had teased them, the same two men travelled north later that same year to the actual site of Rahoy in Argyllshire, one of the classic vitrified forts of the Western Highlands. There, in June of 1937, they attempted a variant of the test on ground that had itself once burned. The results were similar: partial fusion, localized glazing, cracked and reddened stone, but not, in any convincing sense, the reproduction of what the ancient wall had become. The gap between what they could produce with the tools and materials of a serious modern experiment and what the archaeological record actually preserved remained wide. It was, if anything, made wider by the effort, because it demonstrated that even with generous fuel, deliberate construction, and the informed hypothesis of two experienced investigators, the phenomenon resisted reproduction. The archaeological community absorbed the results, weighed them, and largely folded them into a cautious endorsement of the timber lacing model. Child was too eminent, and the experiment too plausible to dismiss. And yet, read carefully, the record of what happened at Plene and Rahoy is not so much a confirmation as a partial failure honestly reported. The men had shown that fire could touch stone and change it. They had not shown that fire could turn stone into glass. Between the singed and the fused, between the glazed surface and the vitrified core, there remained a distance that no amount of pit props and paraffin seemed able to close. 4 decades passed. The world changed. The tools of archaeology sharpened. New generations of researchers, armed with better instruments and a more skeptical eye, returned to the question. And in 1980, under the eye of a television camera and the auspices of one of the most popular science programs of the era, the experiment was run again. Ian Ralston, then a young Aberdeen archaeologist who would go on to spend a large portion of his career mapping and cataloguing the Scottish vitrified forts, set out to build a wall of his own. The location was, in a wry sense, appropriate. An Aberdeen rubbish tip, a piece of unused industrial ground where an 8-metre replica rampart could be raised without disturbing anything of value. The design was based on the best available reconstructions of an Iron Age timber-laced wall. The fuel was carefully calculated. The airflow was considered. The whole apparatus of a modern controlled burn, staged for the benefit of an audience that included Arthur C. Clarke himself, was brought to bear on the ancient problem. They lit it, and the wall burned magnificently. The flames rose into the grey Aberdeen sky. The timbers cracked and collapsed. The stones glowed. For hours the fire consumed itself, and the crew watched, and the cameras rolled, and the anticipation built. And when the fire had burned down and the wall was cool enough to approach, Ralston went in to see what he had made. What he found was once again exactly what Child and Thornycroft had found in 1937. Surface glazing, patches of fused mineral, reddened, cracked, thermally shocked stone, but no monolithic vitrification, no deep fusion of a rampart core, no transformation of a wall of rubble into a single glassy mass of the kind that survives at the Iron Age forts. The camera, which had been positioned to record the moment of scientific triumph, recorded instead the moment of scientific limitation. The experiment had in effect replicated the previous experiment's failure. The gap remained. It is worth pausing on what this means. It is not the failure of a single test. It is the failure of a research program spanning nearly half a century, involving some of the most capable archaeologists of their generations, in 2 countries and under widely varying conditions, and drawing on both the intuitive engineering of the pre-war era and the more disciplined experimental design of the late 20th century. In each case, a wall was built. In each case, a wall was burned. In each case, the fire did something to the stone, and in each case, what the fire did fell short, sometimes dramatically, sometimes only just, of what the ancient walls actually show. The volcanologist Fabian Wadsworth, looking back on this history from the vantage point of modern materials science, has noted that the 1930s experiments were constrained by what he described as arbitrary size and composition, that the parameters chosen were guesses rather than reconstructions of any known ancient wall. And yet, even when the parameters have been refined, even when the experiments have been better designed, better fueled, better ventilated, the same recalcitrance persists. The technology, quite simply, does not yield the result. This is the empirical ceiling. It is not a theoretical objection. It is not a philosophical quibble. It is the collected record of what serious people have actually tried and what has actually happened under the closest thing to controlled conditions that the study of prehistoric fire will ever allow. And what that record tells us is that the current model of how these walls were vitrified, whether by accident, whether by design, whether by the deliberate firing of a captured fort or the ritual immolation of an abandoned one, has yet to be demonstrated as sufficient. The mechanism is asserted. It has not been shown. And in the space between assertion and demonstration, the mystery breathes. Could it be, then, that the source of the heat was something other than what has been supposed? Could it be that the wooden lacing, if it existed at all, was not the fuel but the victim of some other, greater fire? Could the missing element be not more timber, not better airflow, not a longer duration of burn, but a category of heat that the timber lacing hypothesis simply does not contemplate? These are questions the experimental record does not answer, but they are questions the experimental record makes it impossible, in intellectual honesty, to ignore. And with those questions in hand, with the failure of replication as our compass, and the strangeness of the Scottish evidence as our starting point, the horizon of the inquiry widens. The wall on the ridge above Rhynie is only the first of many. Across oceans, across climates, across the reach of every civilization of which we possess any archaeological trace, stones have been found that carry the same signature of impossible heat. And so, the journey turns south and west and across the Atlantic into the thin, cold air of the high Andes. There, above the modern city of Cusco, at nearly 3,500 meters of altitude, rise the terraced walls of Sacsayhuaman. It is a fortress in name and function, a great serrated bastion of stone that crowns the ridge above the old Inca capital, built in successive courses of enormous polygonal blocks, fitted together with the almost supernatural precision that has made the site a byword for ancient masonry. Some of the stones at Sacsayhuaman weigh in the region of 200 tons. They are andesite and limestone, moved from quarries whose locations are still debated, shaped so exactly that the seams between them will not admit a knife's edge, and set into the mountainside in a plan that no one has ever fully explained. To stand at the base of those walls is to feel a physical unease. The scale is wrong, the precision is wrong. The mind reaches for tools that could have done this work, and the tools it finds, copper chisels, bronze hammers, wooden levers, cordage, ramps, feel, in that shadow, laughably insufficient. But it is not only the precision of Sacsayhuaman that has drawn the attention of the researchers who ask the harder questions. It is the surfaces of the stones themselves. Look closely at certain of the blocks, not all of them, but specific and repeatable examples, and one finds patches that are smooth, in a way the surrounding rock is not. Vitreous patches, places where the andesite or the limestone appears to have been not merely polished but glazed, as if a thin layer of the stone's own substance had been briefly liquid, had run, and had set again into a glassy skin. Some analysts describe these as scoop marks, as if a spoon had been drawn across softened rock. Others describe them as splash morphology, patterns consistent with material that has been briefly and violently heated to the point of flow, and then cooled too quickly to recrystallize into its original mineral state. There are researchers who have gone so far as to argue that portions of the wall's fabric are best understood not as cut stone at all, but as a kind of hydraulic lime paste, produced by thermal exposure of the local limestone and then applied and shaped while workable. Whatever one makes of that specific claim, and it is contested, the observation that drives it is not imaginary. The surfaces are there, the glassiness is there, the question of what produced it remains. South and east across the Altiplano, at nearly 4,000 meters above the sea, on the windswept plain near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, another site raises the same question in more extreme form. Pumapunku. The name means, in Aymara, the door of the puma. What survives is a wreckage. Enormous stones scattered as if by some titanic hand, laid out in a plan that even in ruin gives an impression of vanished order. The blocks are andesite. They are cut with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. They have interior mortices and precise rebates and drilled holes whose function is not entirely clear. They are, by any reasonable standard, among the most technically astonishing objects ever produced by any pre-industrial civilization, and their dating and attribution remain matters of active dispute. And on some of those blocks, as at Sacsayhuaman, there are surfaces that appear to have been briefly liquid. Smooth vitreous patches, areas where the mineral texture of the stone gives way to something more like glass. Certain investigators have gone further, claiming that particular blocks exhibit anomalous magnetic signatures, or that thermoluminescence readings from surface layers suggest a heating event distinct in character from the region's known volcanic history. The Andes are, of course, a volcanic country. Vitrification as such is not foreign to the geology of the region, but volcanic glass, obsidian, pumice, ignimbrite, has a signature. It forms in particular contexts. It is not ordinarily found as thin veneers on the outer surfaces of dressed architectural blocks, arrayed in a human plan on a plateau where no volcano has erupted in the relevant time frame. If these features are the products of a volcanic event, that event has yet to be identified. If they are the products of an anthropogenic process, that process has yet to be reconstructed. Mainstream archaeology, understandably, has been cautious. The dominant reading of Sacsayhuaman and Pumapunku emphasizes the extraordinary sophistication of Andean masonry, the patient grinding, the modular prefabrication, the use of harder stones as abrasives against softer, the polishing techniques that could give a surface a luster indistinguishable, at first inspection, from a glaze. The vitreous patches in this reading are the products of weathering, of chemical alteration in a particular microclimate, of biological patterns laid down over centuries, of natural processes acting on stone that has stood in the high sun and the freezing nights for a very long time. It is a defensible position. It accounts for much of what one sees. It has the great virtue of not requiring any unknown mechanism, and yet the more one looks at the specific character of the vitreous surfaces, their localization on particular blocks and not others, their occasional presence at points where fusion between adjacent stones might be inferred, their morphological similarity across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, the harder it becomes to file them under weathering alone. Some researchers, working with portable spectrometers and thermoluminescence techniques, have argued that the mineralogy of these surface layers is chemically distinct from the underlying rock, in ways that natural weathering would not readily produce. Others have noted that the splash morphology, when it appears, has a directionality, a suggestion that whatever produced it came from a particular quarter, at a particular angle, in a particular moment. What one would expect from millennia of rain and frost is uniformity. What one seems sometimes to see is the opposite, a signature of an event. Whether that event was thermal, and whether its temperatures reached the 1,000 to 1,200 degrees Celsius that the proponents of the vitrification reading propose, is a question that cannot be settled by inspection alone. It requires further sampling, further analysis, further honest disagreement. But the observation that draws the question is not fantasy. It is stone. It is present. It is in its own quiet way as insistent as the fused ramparts of Aberdeenshire. And it lies on the other side of the world, in a culture that shared nothing with Iron Age Scotland. Not language, not technology, not even the metallurgy that could produce a bronze axe, and it shows the same defiance of ordinary explanation. 2 data points now on opposite sides of the planet with no cultural bridge between them, a pattern, faint but forming. And then there is Mohenjo-Daro. The city rises, or rather what remains of it rises, from the flat brown floodplain of the lower Indus, in what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan. It was, in its time, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a metropolis of the Harappan civilization at its mature phase, a place of grid-planned streets and standardized bricks and sophisticated drainage, and, by the standards of the third millennium before the Common Era, an urban order almost startling in its modernity. It flourished. It endured for centuries, and then, sometime around 1900 years before the Common Era, it ended. The circumstances of that ending are among the most debated questions in the archaeology of the Indian subcontinent. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, the British archaeologist who directed major excavations at the site in the 1940s and into the 1950s, took a strong view. He believed, on the basis of what he had found, that the city had died violently. He pointed to scattered skeletons in the lower town, not in the tidy configuration of graves, but in the streets, in doorways, in wells, some of them arranged as if they had fallen where they stood. He counted in the end something on the order of 40 such remains, distributed across the lower quarters of the ruined city, and he read into them a story of catastrophe. In one of the most memorable phrases in 20th century archaeology, he declared that Indra stands accused, invoking the Vedic god of war and storm and thunderbolt, and suggesting, in a striking rhetorical flourish, that the city had fallen to the arms of the Indo-Aryan invaders whose epics remembered such destructions. Whether or not one accepts the invasion hypothesis, and modern scholarship has largely stepped away from it, favouring instead a slow decline driven by climate shift and the wandering of the Indus River system, Wheeler's observation of the skeletons themselves was not fabricated. The bodies were there, their disposition was strange, and the story of what they meant was, and remains, unresolved. But the skeletons are only part of what has drawn the attention of the mystery hunters to Mohenjo-Daro. There is also the matter of the bricks. In localized areas of the site, particularly in what would have been the last occupation layer before the abandonment, excavators have documented bricks that appear warped, deformed, and in places fused to one another at their joints. Not kiln-fired, in the ordinary sense. The Harappans knew how to fire brick and their kilns were competent and their products standardized, but fused, as if subjected to a second and far greater fire after emplacement. The proponents of the catastrophic reading argue that the temperatures required to produce this fusion, in situ in the fabric of a standing wall, are simply beyond what any ordinary Bronze Age fire could deliver. A cooking hearth cannot do it. A burning granary cannot do it. Even a widespread urban conflagration, of the kind that has left traces in many ancient cities, does not ordinarily fuse the brick. What could have done it? The mainstream answer is that the fused patches, where they exist, are localized industrial phenomena, remnants of pyrotechnic activity, perhaps of lightning strike, perhaps of some particular hearth or kiln, whose exceptional heat was concentrated in a single place. The skeletons on this account are not contemporaneous with any single event. They are the accumulated residues of squatter occupations, of informal interments, of the untidy afterlife of a great city as it faded from history. There is no massacre, there is no fire from the sky. There is only a slow, sad, environmental decline, punctuated by the accidents of ruin. And yet, and here the pattern begins to hum, the observation persists. There are, in a specific corner of a specific ancient city, bricks that have been melted at their joints. There are, in the streets above, human remains that fell and were not buried. There is a directionality to the fusion, some have argued, as if the heat came from above or from a particular quarter and swept across the fabric of the city in a single moment. The scale is not the scale of a hearth. The temperature is not the temperature of a hearth. And whatever one makes of Wheeler's dramatic invocation of Indra, the underlying material observation, that portions of Mohenjo-Daro appear to have been briefly and intensely heated, in situ, to temperatures that no ordinary explanation comfortably accommodates, has not been dismissed by any subsequent analysis. It has merely been argued around. 3 sites now: Scotland, the Andes, the Indus. 3 cultures with no meaningful contact. 3 landscapes as different as the earth affords, and in each of them, stones or bricks that have been changed by heat in ways the record of ordinary human fire does not easily explain. The doorway that opened on the ridge above Rhynie has led into a wider room, and the room, one begins to suspect, is larger still, because eastward, across the Zagros and the Anatolian plateau, another vanished capital waits in its own layer of ash. The plateau of central Anatolia in high summer is a hard country. The grass burns to the colour of straw by July. The wind moves across the uplands with a dry insistence, and the horizon is broken only by the folds of ridge and gorge that hide, in one particular curve of the land, the remains of a city that once considered itself the equal of Egypt. To reach it, one climbs from the modern village of Boazkal into terrain that seems to rise in tiers, each terrace higher and more windswept than the last, until at some indefinable point the ground itself becomes archaeology. Wall stubs emerge from the turf. Foundations trace out chambers that no longer have ceilings. A gateway, framed by 2 eroded lions whose faces the centuries have softened but not erased, opens onto nothing. This is Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, and even in ruin it possesses the peculiar authority of a place that once knew itself to be a centre of the world. The Hittites made their capital here in the 17th century before the Common Era, and for something like 500 years the city grew, elaborated and layered itself upon its own past. At its height, Hattusa spread across a vast enclosed area, its inner citadel crowned with royal palaces, its lower town crowded with temples, its perimeter defended by walls whose construction remains even now a study in Bronze Age ingenuity. The Hittites wrote of themselves in a cuneiform script pressed into clay, and the tablets recovered from the archives here, tens of thousands of them, patiently sorted and catalogued by generations of scholars, record diplomacy with pharaohs, treaties with rival kings, prayers and omens and the elaborate liturgies of a state that called its home the City of 1,000 Gods. Massive gates, each bearing its own guardian figures, the Lion Gate, the Sphinx Gate, the King's Gate, anchored the defensive circuit. To stand today at any of them, and to look inland across the tumbled foundations of the temples, is to look upon a plan whose ambition has not been diminished by the collapse of the roof beams that once covered it. Systematic excavation at Hattusa has been the work of the German Archaeological Institute since the very first years of the 20th century, an unbroken programme of research extending through Kurt Bittel, Peter Neve, Jürgen Seher and Andreas Schachner. Few sites in the ancient world have been read as patiently or as continuously, and it is out of that long and careful reading that a particular observation has emerged, one which, at first, seems merely to confirm what any visitor might guess from the tumble of blackened stone underfoot. Hattusa burned, the final layer of the city, dated to the end of the 13th century and the opening of the 12th before the Common Era, is marked by fire. Ash. Fallen timbers reduced to charcoal, mud brick reddened and cracked, limestone discoloured in places to something that the eye reads immediately as scorching. Mainstream archaeology has framed this destruction within a coherent story. The Hittite state in its last decades had been under mounting strain. Trade routes were disintegrating, harvests were failing, correspondence recovered from the archives and from allied cities like Ugarit on the Syrian coast speaks of hunger, of grain shipments urgently requested and inadequately delivered, of a world in which the ordinary sinews of imperial administration were beginning to fray, and when the end came, it appears from the excavated evidence to have been in some measure orderly. The royal archives before the fire were stripped of their most valuable documents. Treasures were removed. The state seems to have withdrawn from its own capital before the flames took it. As the historian Trevor Bryce has put it, the city being uncovered by archaeologists was probably little more than a ghost town during its final days. The people who mattered had already gone. Only the buildings, and whoever remained behind, awaited whatever came next. Whatever came next set the city alight, and this is where the observation begins to bend towards something less easily contained by the ordinary narratives of siege and sack. In the region of certain gateways, and in particular localized zones of the defensive circuit, the German excavators have documented heat effects on mud brick and limestone that go beyond what a burning building, or even a burning quarter, would ordinarily produce. Mud brick, when it is subjected to fire, will redden and harden, will crack, will in extreme cases begin to warp. But there is a threshold beyond which mud brick is not usually taken by an anthropogenic fire, and the material at Hattusa, in specific places, has passed it. Limestone similarly does not ordinarily vitrify. It calcines, it powders, it changes colour. But there are localized patches at Hattusa where the stone appears to have been briefly carried to temperatures at which its surface behaves more like slag than like burned rock. The German team, cautious as such teams must be, has read these zones as evidence of intense, localized combustion, points at which some particular fuel or some particular concentration of flammable material or some particular quirk of oxygen supply produced heat far beyond the ambient conflagration. It is a reasonable and disciplined interpretation, and yet the pattern, once one has been looking for it, is not entirely soothed by that reading. The heat effects are not always at the places where one would expect intensive combustion. They are sometimes at gate structures whose contents cannot easily be reconstructed as a fuel-rich hoard. They are sometimes on exposed masonry surfaces where the physics of oxygen flow and radiant heating do not obviously favour a runaway hotspot. The mainstream account is not implausible, and no responsible reading of Hattusa can simply set it aside. But the material observation that in certain places the very walls of the Hittite capital were carried to temperatures at which mud brick begins to slag and limestone begins to glaze, sits uneasily beside the tidy story of a ghost city burning after its owners have left. Who lit the fire? What burned so hot? And why, in the gateway structures of all places, the very thresholds through which the last inhabitants must have fled, if they fled at all, should the stone remember an event that ordinary burning does not commit to memory? Standing at the Lion Gate now, with the summer wind moving across the grass and the eroded faces of the beasts watching one's approach with the patience of eroded stone, one feels the strangeness of it. The gate opens onto emptiness. Behind it, the terraces of the citadel descend toward the temples of the lower town. Somewhere in this circuit, at a date around 3,200 years distant from the present, a fire took hold that would not have surprised any siege veteran of the ancient world, and in specific places a heat took hold that would have surprised them very much indeed. The wind moves, the lions watch, and the question of what precisely happened on that final day or in that final week remains among the unresolved businesses of the archaeological record. To grasp the full weight of Hattusa's end, one has to step back from the plateau and consider the map of the eastern Mediterranean as it stood in the closing decades of the 13th century before the Common Era. It was a world of astonishing interconnection. Copper from Cyprus, tin from further east, olive oil in stamped jars from the Aegean, tribute of gold and lapis, and worked ivory moving between courts, embassies exchanged between pharaohs and Hittite kings and Mycenaean warlords, and the merchant princes of Ugarit. This was not a scatter of isolated cultures, but a single, humming, deeply interdependent civilizational system whose maintenance required constant flows of metal, grain, and diplomatic reassurance across long and vulnerable routes. And then, within roughly a 50-year window centered on the year 1200 before the Common Era, that system came apart. Mycenae fell, Tiryns fell, Pylos, whose archives of Linear B tablets record the last anxious mustering of watchers along the coast, fell. Ugarit, on the northern Syrian shore, fell so completely that its final tablets were recovered still baking in the destruction levels. One of them, famously, a letter from the king pleading for aid against ships appearing off his coast, a letter that seems never to have been dispatched. Hazor, in the Galilean uplands, burned. Megiddo, guarding the pass between the coastal plain and the interior, burned. Emar on the Euphrates was destroyed. Alalak was destroyed. Along the length of the Levantine coast and across the Aegean and up onto the Anatolian plateau, city after city was consumed within a span so tight that, on the archaeological timescale, it reads almost as simultaneity. Whole scripts vanished from use. Whole administrative systems evaporated. Whole polities disappeared from history without heirs. This is the event that the historian and archaeologist Eric Klein has anatomized in his book on the year 1177 before the Common Era, and it is Klein's framing that has come to dominate the modern scholarly consensus. Rather than searching for a single villain, the invading sea peoples of Rameses III's Egyptian reliefs, or a great earthquake storm along the Anatolian fault zones, or a single catastrophic drought, Klein has argued for what he calls a perfect storm, a synergy of stressors: climate change tightening the harvests over decades, drought and famine hollowing out the resilience of state granaries, seismic activity toppling walls in some regions, internal rebellion as populations, squeezed by scarcity, turned upon their palatial elites, migrating peoples, themselves displaced by the collapse of their own home systems, moving through the vulnerable seams of an already weakened order. And above all, the fatal interdependence of the entire network, the fact that when one node failed, the failure propagated. Kingdoms, in Klein's memorable phrase, fell like dominoes. This is a powerful and on its own terms a persuasive model. It respects the multiplicity of the evidence. It does not require any single, unlikely mechanism to bear the whole weight of explanation. It integrates climate data, demographic strain, political correspondence, and archaeological destruction layers into a single systemic account. And for the questions it seeks to answer, why did this civilizational order collapse in this particular way at this particular time? It has few serious rivals. The mainstream consensus around some version of the perfect storm is neither lazy nor obtuse. It has been built by careful people over several decades of reading, and yet the storm model, for all its coherence, has a soft edge, and the edge is precisely where our inquiry has been pressing. The perfect storm explains why cities were vulnerable. It explains why populations moved, why states weakened, why trade routes failed, why the tinder of the Bronze Age lay ready for a match. What it does not fully explain is the fire itself. Or more precisely, it does not explain the temperatures embedded in certain of the destruction layers, the fusion, the vitrification, the localized evidence at Hattusa and elsewhere that particular walls, in particular quarters, were briefly carried to heats that a hungry population setting light to a granary does not readily produce. Archaeologists have noted with some unease that at many of these sites the storerooms burned with their goods still inside, amphorae full of oil, sacks of grain, stockpiles of the very commodities that any invader would ordinarily seize first. If the collapse was, at root, an economic catastrophe driven by resource scarcity, why did the fires burn atop the resources? And if the fires were unusually intense, hot enough to leave signatures that ordinary burning does not leave, what furnished the extra heat? Klein himself does not, of course, invoke anything extraordinary. Neither do the German excavators at Hattusa, nor the archaeologist working at Ugarit or Hazer or Megiddo. The tools of the discipline, applied honestly, produce the tools of the discipline's answers: siege fires, accidents in already burning cities, concentrations of pitch, of oil, of stored fuel, going up in whatever local hells the destruction happened to produce. Every one of these explanations is available and in its own place defensible. The difficulty is only that the same explanation, offered site after site, produces a pattern of local coincidences that begins, at scale, to look less coincidental. A dozen intense hotspots at a dozen cities burned within 50 years might be the normal residue of a bad half-century. It might also be the signature of something the mainstream framework has not yet accommodated, and the observation, once made, does not go away. The perfect storm accounts for the ruin. It accounts for the ash. It does not quite account for the glass. This is the gap the documentary means to keep open. It is not a gap that requires us to overthrow Eric Klein, or to dismiss the excavators at Boaz Kale, or to imagine that the climate data and the migration models and the correspondence of dying kings are somehow wrong. It is a gap that lies within, and to one side of, the mainstream account, a persistent material anomaly that the mainstream account has treated, understandably, as noise. Whether the noise is really noise or whether it is the faint outline of a signal that the discipline has not yet learned to read is the question that presses upon us. And the question presses hardest precisely where the storm model is strongest, because a model that explains almost everything is a model with a very particular set of blind spots. The blind spot at Hattusa and at its dozen sister cities has a name. The name is heat. Heat beyond what the story predicts. Heat that the walls remember. To follow the question further, one has to leave the plateau of central Anatolia altogether and travel south and west, out of the world of collapsing Bronze Age states, and into a landscape that has no cities in it at all. The Great Sand Sea, straddling the modern border between Egypt and Libya, is one of the most inhuman terrains on Earth. It is a country of dunes, some of them tens of meters high, marching in parallel ridges for hundreds of kilometers. There are no rivers here, no oases within a day's travel, no shelter from the sun, no reliable landmarks by which to steer. The Bedouin who know the fringes of it will not enter its interior lightly. And yet across roughly 800 square kilometers of this desolation, some estimates place the affected area much larger still, extending across several thousand square kilometers of scattered occurrence. The sand is dusted with pieces of pale, translucent, faintly yellow-green glass. The glass lies on the surface. Some pieces are the size of a thumbnail, others are the size of a fist. A few, occasionally, are considerably larger. Their edges are worn by wind and abrasion into rounded, almost pebbled forms, but their interiors remain limpid, and when the light passes through them, they cast the faint golden shadow of a substance that is nearly pure silica. Analysis of Libyan desert glass, as it has come to be called, has established that it consists of roughly 98% silicon dioxide, a purity that ordinary volcanic glasses do not approach, and that ordinary fulgurites, the glassy tubes left by lightning strikes in sand, cannot produce at anything remotely like this scale. It is quite simply one of the purest naturally occurring glasses on the surface of the Earth, and it lies scattered across a sand sea in quantities that defy any small or local explanation. The material has been known to human beings for a very long time. In 1922, when Howard Carter and his patrons opened the burial chamber of the pharaoh Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, one of the treasures they lifted from the young king's chest was a pectoral, an elaborate breastplate of gold and inlay in which the central element was a scarab. The scarab had been carved from a piece of pale, faintly greenish translucent stone, and for decades after its discovery the material of the scarab was catalogued vaguely as chalcedony. It was only later, when investigators compared the substance of the scarab to samples brought back from the desert, that it was identified with certainty as Libyan desert glass. The pharaoh had worn on his breast, in the last ritual dressing before his tomb was sealed, a fragment of a substance that had been formed in a paroxysm of heat somewhere out in the western sand, a substance whose origin his own priests almost certainly did not know, but whose beauty was already being harvested by his craftsmen. Whatever event produced the glass, it produced it long enough ago that by the time of the New Kingdom in Egypt, the pieces were merely lying there to be gathered. Modern scientific investigation of the field began in earnest in 1932, when the British surveyor Patrick Clayton, mapping the Great Sand Sea, brought back samples that puzzled the geologists to whom he showed them. In the decades since, the material has been analysed by a succession of researchers, among them the Italian geologist Vincenzo de Michele, and, later and most influentially, the Egyptian-American planetary geologist Farouk El-Baz, whose remote sensing work on the Eastern Sahara has done much to place the glass field in its regional context. Their conclusions, arrived at through independent lines of evidence, converge upon a single essential point. Libyan desert glass cannot have been produced by ordinary terrestrial fire. It cannot have been produced by any volcanic process for which evidence exists in the region. It cannot have been produced by lightning at anything approaching the observed scale. It could only have been produced by a heat event that briefly raised the temperature of an enormous swath of the desert surface to something on the order of at least 1800 degrees Celsius, and by some estimates considerably higher, up toward 2750 degrees or beyond. Temperatures, in short, that no anthropogenic and no ordinary geological process on the Earth's surface can deliver. The mainstream geological consensus, arrived at through the discovery of characteristic shock-metamorphosed minerals within the glass, traces of rhyodite, high-pressure transformations in zircon crystals, and other signatures that only extreme pressure and heat can produce, is that Libyan desert glass is an impactite. That is, it is the melted product of a hypervelocity encounter between the Earth's surface and an incoming celestial body. As the planetary geologist Aaron Cavosi has put it, only meteorite impacts create the shock waves that form high-pressure minerals of this kind. The evidence, examined at the level of the crystal lattice, points unmistakably to a cosmic origin, to something arriving from outside the atmosphere at a velocity sufficient to convert a portion of its kinetic energy and a portion of the sand it encountered into a brief planet-scale furnace. Precisely how that event unfolded remains the subject of active and unresolved debate. The two principal candidates are a direct surface impact, which ought to have left a crater, and an airburst, an explosion of the incoming body at altitude, whose energy would have showered the terrain with intense radiant heat, without necessarily excavating a crater at all. The absence of any clearly identified impact structure in the region has, for decades, complicated the surface impact model. Recent nanoscale evidence, some researchers argue, favours the surface impact reading after all, with the crater either buried beneath the shifting dunes or eroded beyond present recognition. Others continue to hold that only an airburst can adequately explain the aerial distribution of the glass. This is a debate that will occupy us in its own right shortly, because it is not a debate confined to the Sahara. The same question, impact or airburst, will return, with different terrain and different evidence, at other sites we have yet to visit. For the moment, the essential point is simpler and more disorienting. Somewhere in the deep past, in the terrain that is now the Great Sand Sea, an event occurred that vitrified a region of the Earth's surface across an area larger than many modern cities. It did so at temperatures that no ancient fire could match. It left, as its residue, a scatter of translucent glass so pure that a pharaoh's craftsman would eventually gather it and set it into royal jewellery. And the mechanism of the event was not human. It could not have been human. It was something the sky had done to the ground. The dating of the event, however, is not as securely fixed as the mechanism. The most widely cited figure places the formation of Libyan desert glass at approximately 28 to 29 million years ago, derived from fission track dating of individual grains and from other radiometric approaches. On this reckoning, whatever fell upon the Sahara fell in the Oligocene, in a landscape that bore no resemblance to today's desert, and that would not host human beings or their remote ancestors for tens of millions of years to come. If that dating is correct, then the Libyan glass is entirely irrelevant to any question about ancient cities. It is a geological curiosity, a piece of extraterrestrial vandalism from before humanity's arrival, coincidentally lying about on a surface that later peoples would occasionally pick over. But the dating has not gone unchallenged. Some researchers have pointed out that the fission track methodology, applied to a material as unusual as this, may not yield results as reliable as its use in other contexts implies. There have been proposals, tentative and contested, that at least some of the glass may have formed considerably more recently than the Oligocene consensus allows, that the field, or portions of it, may bear witness to events on a timescale nearer to the human. These proposals are minority views. They have not overturned the standard chronology, and the standard chronology remains the working assumption of most researchers in the field. But the questions have been raised, and they have not been definitively closed, and it is honest to note that the dating of Libyan desert glass is a matter about which the last word has not yet been written. We hold that uncertainty open for the moment, because it will matter later. For now, it is enough to have added the desert to the map. Scotland, the Andes, the Indus, Anatolia, and now a swath of the Sahara so large that from orbit it can be traced as a faint gleaming region against the ordinary sand. 4 of these are places where human beings built things and something changed those things by heat. The 5th is a place where human beings built nothing, and the heat came anyway, from the sky, and left behind a signature so unambiguous that even the most cautious geologists will agree it can only have come from outside the Earth. The question that begins to press upon the mind as one moves from site to site is whether these are 5 entirely separate stories with a merely superficial resemblance, or whether the resemblance goes deeper, whether, in some corner of the record we've not yet learned to read cleanly, the ridge above Rini and the melted stones of Cusco and the fused bricks of Mohenjo-Daro and the slagged gates of Hattusa and the pale yellow glass in the Great Sand Sea are connected by something more than the coincidence of extreme temperature, whether there is, in short, a common cause. The path to that question runs, first, through the debate that has been simmering for decades around the Libyan glass itself, the debate about how precisely an object from beyond the Earth delivers its energy to the ground. 2 hypotheses have dominated that debate, and though they share a common ancestor, an object from space, arriving at cosmic velocities, they diverge in almost every meaningful particular, and the divergence matters. It matters because the 2 mechanisms produce different signatures, different landscapes, different ranges of destruction, and different chances of survival for anything caught beneath them. The first hypothesis is the older and, at first hearing, the more intuitive. A meteorite, a coherent body of stone or iron, perhaps hundreds of meters across, punches through the atmosphere at a speed measured in tens of kilometers per second, retains most of its mass and momentum, and strikes the ground. The impact converts kinetic energy into heat and pressure on scales that dwarf anything human experience prepares us to imagine. Rock at the point of contact is vaporized outright. Rock around the point of contact is melted, flung outward as droplets, and rains back across the surrounding landscape as a scatter of glassy tektites. A crater is excavated, a bowl of shocked and shattered stone, sometimes tens of kilometers wide, its rim of overturned strata standing testimony to the violence beneath. In the classic impact scenario, the Libyan glass field is precisely such an ejector blanket, spread outward from a source crater that ought to lie somewhere in or near the Great Sand Sea itself. That the crater has not yet been convincingly identified is, on this reading, a problem of visibility rather than existence. The Sahara moves, dune fields migrate, entire landscapes are buried and re-exposed on timescales of millennia. A crater 29 million years old in such a place might well lie beneath hundreds of meters of shift in sand, its telltale ring detectable only by gravity anomalies or magnetic surveys not yet performed with sufficient resolution over the right patch of desert. The mainstream case for impact rests on this expectation that the crater is there, waiting, and that better instruments will one day find it. The second hypothesis dispenses with the crater entirely because it dispenses with the ground strike. In the airburst model, the incoming body, cometary perhaps, or a fragile stony asteroid, does not survive its passage through the lower atmosphere. It breaks apart. It detonates. The kinetic energy that would have been delivered to the surface as a hammer blow is instead released in the air, high enough that no crater forms, low enough that the thermal pulse and the shock wave reach the ground with catastrophic intensity. In such an event, a column of superheated air descends upon the landscape. Sand at the surface, silica-rich and already dry, is raised in an instant from ordinary desert temperatures to something exceeding 1800 degrees Celsius. In the most violent scenarios, past 2700, hotter than the surface of a foundry. It melts, it fuses, it cools, and in cooling it becomes glass. The scatter is broad because the thermal footprint of an airburst is broad, tens or hundreds of kilometers across rather than the concentrated bowl of an impact. The absence of a crater is not a problem to be explained away. It is a prediction of the model. There is no crater because nothing struck the ground. For much of the 20th century, the impact model held the field almost by default. Craters were what one expected from cosmic collisions, and the failure to find one at the Libyan glass field was regarded as a temporary embarrassment rather than a fatal flaw. But in 2013, the balance shifted. A team led by the South African geochemist Jan Kramers published a study of a small dark pebble found within the Libyan glass field, a specimen whose interior, examined at the microscopic level, contained a mineral that had not been previously reported from any natural terrestrial context. The mineral was hapkite, an iron silicide with the formula Fe2Si, known chiefly as a product of the kind of vapor phase deposition that occurs when metallic material is vaporized and then recondenses at extremely high temperatures under low oxygen conditions. Hapkite had been identified in lunar samples, where micrometeorite bombardment vaporizes tiny pockets of iron-rich material and lets them redeposit. To find it in the middle of a Libyan glass pebble was to find, in effect, a fingerprint of the impactor itself. Kramers and his colleagues argued that the pebble represented a fragment of the incoming body, or of material altered by close contact with it during the terminal explosion. evidence not of a meteorite that had reached the ground, but of a body that had vaporized in midair, its metallic content reduced to atomic dust, and then recondensed into the interior of the glass it had helped to create. The airburst model on this argument had acquired a specific mineralogical signature. It was no longer merely a plausible alternative to the impact hypothesis. It had a piece of physical evidence that, on its face, fitted it better than the impact scenario fitted. The response when it came was not a refutation so much as a complication. In 2019, a team led by the geologist Aaron Kavosi published work on zircon grains from within the Libyan glass, small tough crystals of zirconium silicate that survive processes which destroy softer minerals and which record in the arrangement of their atoms the pressures they have endured. Kavosi's team found within some of these zircons the mineral rhyodite, a high-pressure polymorph of zircon that forms only under shock pressures characteristic of hypervelocity impact. Rhyodite has never been produced by any known atmospheric process, however energetic. It requires the direct transfer of mechanical shock through solid rock at pressures measured in tens of gigapascals, and such pressures are, so far as anyone has yet demonstrated, only produced by a body striking the ground at cosmic speed. Kavosi's summary of the situation was pithy and telling. Both meteorite impacts and airbursts, he observed, can cause melting. Only meteorite impacts create shock waves that form high-pressure minerals. The rhyodite was, on this reading, a signature the airburst model could not by itself explain. Where does this leave the field? Not with a resolution, but with an interesting composite. There are researchers who now suspect that both mechanisms may have been involved, that the event which produced the Libyan glass was neither a clean airburst nor a clean impact, but something in between, a body which fragmented at altitude, released much of its energy as a thermal pulse over a wide area, and then delivered surviving fragments to the ground with enough residual velocity to shock the local rocks and generate rhyodite in a comparatively small volume of material. Such hybrid events are physically plausible. Large incoming bodies do not always behave tidily. They can break apart in the upper atmosphere, spread their kinetic energy across multiple explosions at multiple altitudes, and produce signatures that no single mechanism model captures neatly. The Libyan glass field on this reading may be the residue of a compound event, mostly airburst, with an impactor's coda, whose full character can only be reconstructed by holding both hypotheses simultaneously in mind and being willing to let each account for what it accounts for best. What remains beyond dispute in all of this is the raw thermodynamic fact. Something happened in the sky above the Sahara tens of millions of years ago, or possibly less, that delivered enough heat to the ground to convert quartz sand into fused silica across an area the size of a small country. The debate is not about whether this occurred, it is about how, and specifically about whether the delivery mechanism was one that required a body to strike the earth, or one that permitted a body to release its energy without ever touching it. And the reason this matters, the reason we've paused so long over a scatter of yellow glass in an empty desert, is that the second possibility, the airburst, opens a door that the first does not. If a body can release megatons of energy in the air above a surface and leave that surface transformed by heat without ever cratering it, then the range of events capable of producing anomalous vitrification on the ground becomes very much wider than it appears on first inspection. Impact craters are conspicuous. They are the sort of feature that, given time and instrumentation, will eventually be found. An airburst signature is subtler. It consists of thermal alteration, of scattered fused material, of anomalous mineral inclusions, perhaps of a broad and shallow distribution of trace elements, and none of these features announce themselves the way a 20-kilometre crater announces itself from orbit. An airburst can happen and pass, and leave the landscape looking at a casual glance essentially unchanged. The trees are gone, but trees regrow. The sand is glassed, but sand blows over glass. The hillside is scorched, but scorch marks weather. Only where the heat has fused something durable, something like stone or brick or the mineral core of a fortification, will the signature persist across the centuries, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. That an airburst can do this is not in itself speculative. We have watched one do it, not on the scale of the Libyan event, and not with the same terminal energy, but on a scale sufficient to demonstrate the mechanism and to preserve a set of witnesses who could describe in the first person what such an event looks and feels like from beneath. On the morning of the 30th of June, 1908, in the taiga forest of central Siberia, along the basin of the Podkamenaya Tunguska River, the sky opened. It was a little after 7 in the morning by local reckoning. The day was clear. The forest, an immense expanse of larch and pine and birch stretching for hundreds of kilometres in every direction, was almost entirely empty of human beings. There were reindeer herders in the region, mostly Evenki. There were scattered trappers. There was a trading post at the settlement of Vanavara, some 60 kilometres from what would prove to be the epicentre. Beyond these thin threads of human presence, the land was as it had been for millennia: vast, cold, silent, indifferent. What descended over that landscape has been reconstructed from eyewitness accounts and from the physical record the event left in the soil and in the trees. A column of bluish-white light appeared in the northern sky, moving southeast, so bright that observers said it rivaled the sun. It was followed by an explosion, or a series of explosions, in the air, at an altitude that later analysis has placed somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometres above the ground. The object, whatever it was, never reached the surface. It disintegrated in mid-air, and it released, in that disintegration, an amount of energy that has been estimated at between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT equivalent, perhaps 1,000 times the yield of the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima 37 years later. The consequences were on the same scale as the energy. Some 2,150 square kilometres of forest were flattened. 80 million trees, by later estimation, were snapped or uprooted, laid out in a radial pattern that pointed unmistakably back toward the epicentre. Trunks lying like matchsticks felled from a single blow, their crowns pointing outward, their bases toward the centre of the explosion. Directly beneath the burst at what has come to be called the epicentre, some trees remained standing but were stripped of their branches and their bark, scorched but not toppled, silent witnesses to a pressure wave that had passed over them vertically rather than horizontally. The pattern was so distinctive that when the first scientific expeditions reached the region, decades later, in the 1920s, led by the Russian mineralogist Leonid Kulik, they were able to map the vector of the incoming body simply by walking through the forest and noting the direction in which the dead trees pointed. But the trees are only the physical record. The human record from the sparse population who happened to be within range of what had occurred is more visceral. A herder camped in his tent some 40 kilometres from the epicentre was thrown into the air along with his tent, tumbling several metres before landing deaf and disoriented. A trader at Vanavara, 60 kilometres out, was sitting on the porch of the trading post when he saw the sky to the north split open in a wall of fire. In an account taken down years later, he described it in words that have become part of the folklore of the event. At that moment, he said, he became so hot that he could not bear it, as if his shirt were on fire. He tried to rip the shirt off, but before he could, a sound like thunder struck him, and he was flung several meters from the porch and knocked briefly unconscious. When he came to, the roof of the post was damaged, windows were shattered along the walls of the building, and to the north the sky was full of a strange dark cloud rising into the upper atmosphere. The thermal pulse, the flash of radiant heat that reached the ground before the shock wave, was intense enough to scorch skin at distances at which no fragment of the object itself ever arrived. This is the signature of an airburst, heat delivered as radiation, unmediated by contact, reaching outward from the explosion at the speed of light and depositing energy on whatever surfaces it encountered until absorbed or dispersed. On dry vegetation, it kindled fires. On exposed human skin, it produced burns. Had it fallen upon a stone wall, or a mud brick rampart, or a pavement of shaped blocks, it would have deposited energy upon those surfaces too. Energy which, depending on its intensity and duration, would have manifested as scorching, as glazing, as vitrification, as the reduction of ordinary building materials to fused and glassy residue. The pressure wave that followed the thermal pulse was equally extraordinary. Seismic stations across Europe registered it. Barographs, the instruments that record atmospheric pressure, in the United Kingdom, some 5,000 kilometers from the epicenter, recorded distinct disturbances as the wave passed. Nights in the days that followed were unusually bright across northern Europe, apparently owing to dust and ice injected high into the atmosphere by the explosion and scattering sunlight across latitudes where the sun had ordinarily set. Newspapers in London in the days after the event remarked on the strange luminous nights without any idea of their cause. The connection to Siberia would not be made for years, and the crater, there was none. When Kulik finally reached the region in 1927, expecting to find a substantial impact bowl at the heart of the flattened forest, he found instead a patch of swampy ground where trees had been reduced to charred stumps, and where the pattern of blast damage pointed toward but did not encompass any depression that could be identified as a crater in the classical sense. There were bogs, and there were signs of surface disturbance, and there was a great deal of dead wood, but there was no impactor and no impact site. The object had unmade itself in the air. What remained on the ground was the shadow of the event, the geometry of destruction, the burn patterns, the seismic and atmospheric traces, but not the object which had caused it. Later, analyses would identify subtle chemical anomalies in the soil at the epicenter. Elevated concentrations of iridium and other elements associated with extraterrestrial material were reported, consistent with the vaporized residue of a stony asteroid or a comet 50 to 60 meters across. But these were traces, dispersed and easily overlooked. Without the fallen forest, without the vast radial pattern of dead trees pointing back toward a common origin, the event might not have been recognizable at all. A century after the fact, standing in that forest, one confronts the essential lesson of Tunguska. The sky can strike the ground with the force of 1,000 Hiroshimas and leave behind no obvious wound. The wound is in what has been changed by heat, in what has been laid flat by pressure, in the traces of alien matter mixed invisibly into the soil. It is not in the ground itself. This is the airburst as living laboratory. It happened. It is documented. It occurred on the scale of megatons within the span of a single human life still preserved in written record. And it demonstrated, beyond further argument, that the mechanism which the Libyan glass hypothesis proposes for a much older and much larger event is not a mere theoretical possibility, but a physical reality of the Earth's atmosphere. Bodies from space do detonate above the ground. They do release megaton-scale energies without cratering. They do deposit thermal energy across surfaces measured in thousands of square kilometers. And they do leave behind, as their signature, precisely the kind of alteration, burned, fused, scorched, glazed, that the mind is invited to compare with what one finds on certain ancient walls. The Tunguska event was a small one, by cosmological standards. 50 to 60 meters across, 10 to 15 megatons of yield. What happens when the incoming body is larger? What happens when the energy is not 15 megatons but 100 or 500? What happens when the airburst occurs not over an empty forest but over a populated landscape, or a coastal plain, or a river valley in which cities have been built? We have models to guide us, and we have, increasingly, geological evidence as well. In 2007, a group of researchers led by the physicist Richard Firestone published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that proposed a specific and dramatic answer to that question, at least for one particular moment in the deep past. The proposal has come to be known as the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and though it remains hotly contested within the scientific community, it has generated over the intervening years a body of physical evidence too substantial to dismiss and too suggestive to ignore. The hypothesis, in its broad outlines, is this. Approximately 12,900 years ago, at the moment when the Earth was emerging from the last ice age, when great herds of megafauna still roamed the plains of North America, when the Clovis peoples were the dominant human culture of that continent, a fragmented comet or asteroid encountered the atmosphere and detonated, either as a series of airbursts or as a mixed sequence of airbursts and small impacts, primarily over North America, but with effects extending across 4 continents. The event on this reading injected enormous quantities of dust and soot into the upper atmosphere, triggered widespread wildfires, and abruptly reversed the ongoing warming trend, plunging the northern hemisphere back into approximately 1,200 years of near-glacial cold, the period known to climatologists as the Younger Dryas. The event further by this hypothesis drove the megafauna extinctions that swept the Americas at approximately that time, the disappearance of mammoths and mastodons, of giant sloths and short-faced bears, of horses and camels from the continent where they had originated. And it caused, or at least coincided with, the sudden collapse of the Clovis culture, whose distinctive fluted projectile points ceased to appear in the archaeological record above a particular sedimentary boundary and are replaced by a fragmented mosaic of successor cultures. The physical evidence adduced for this hypothesis is what makes it interesting and what makes it relevant to the wider inquiry we've been pursuing. At sites across North America, and increasingly at sites in Europe, in the Middle East, in South America, researchers working within the framework of the hypothesis have identified a distinctive sedimentary horizon, the Younger Dryas boundary, or YDB, which lies at the level in the soil corresponding to the moment of the proposed event. This horizon is often marked by what field geologists have come to call the black mat, a dark, carbon-rich layer, only a few centimeters thick, that appears in Clovis-age sediments across a striking geographic range. Above the black mat, the fauna and the cultural material are different from what lies below. It is, in the language of the field, a signature of abrupt transition, a line drawn across the sediment beneath which one world existed, and above which a different one begins. Within the black mat and within the YDB horizon more broadly, proponents of the hypothesis have reported a suite of markers whose combined presence they argue is inconsistent with ordinary terrestrial processes. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds of a size and structure associated with high-energy shock events. Magnetic microspherules, tiny beads of iron-rich material of the sort produced when molten droplets cool rapidly in air. Carbon spherules of similar morphology, elevated concentrations of platinum and of iridium, elements rare at the Earth's surface but abundant in certain classes of extraterrestrial material, and, more strikingly still, what researchers have described as shock-fractured quartz, minerals whose atomic structure appears to have been reconfigured by a moment of extreme pressure and heat, morphed at the crystalline level into melted silica. Metallic debris, in the phrasing of one summary, geochemically consistent with cometary dust. A signature, in other words, of the sort of event whose modern in-miniature analogue we've already met. An airburst on an incomparably vaster scale, imprinting itself on the geological record of an entire hemisphere. Not everyone accepts this reading. The scientific community on this question is divided in ways that go beyond ordinary academic disagreement. Critics have argued that the markers reported by proponents are not reliably reproducible from site to site, that they have been misidentified in some cases, that they are consistent with ordinary terrestrial processes, with volcanic activity, with wildfire, with contamination from modern sources, and that the hypothesis as a whole rests on an accumulation of ambiguous evidence rather than on any single decisive finding. Alternative explanations for the Younger Dryas cooling, a sudden release of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting oceanic circulation, has long been the leading candidate, remain in play, and are, in the view of many researchers, more parsimonious than a cosmic impact. The debate is unresolved, and it has been marked on both sides by unusually sharp exchanges. But for our purposes, what matters is not whether the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct in every particular. What matters is that it exists, that it has been formally proposed in the pages of one of the most eminent scientific journals in the world, that it is supported by a set of physical markers spread across 4 continents, and that it lays out, for anyone willing to attend to it, the template. A template of what such an event would look like in the geological record. A template of what to search for. A template of what the signature of a catastrophic aerial thermal event might resemble, once the event itself has faded from memory and only the altered soil remains. Nanodiamonds, spherules of melted material, shock-fractured quartz, elevated iridium and platinum, a dark, carbon-rich horizon marking the abrupt boundary between a world before and a world after. If such markers accompany the Younger Dryas, if they accompany on a smaller scale the Tunguska event, then the question that begins, slowly, to press itself upon the mind is whether such markers might also be found at other places, in other layers, near the walls of other ruined cities. Whether, in the soil beneath the vitrified ramparts and the fused bricks and the glazed gateway blocks we've already met, there might be something waiting to be looked for that no one has yet thought to look for. Whether the story we've been assembling site by site has left its signature not only in the stones themselves but in the ground around them, and so we must learn to read the soil. We must learn, before we go further, the language in which the earth records its own catastrophes, because the walls alone cannot testify. Stone can be melted by many things, also critics will always maintain, and a fused rampart on its own is a riddle without a key. But the ground beneath the rampart and the ground beyond it, and the ground around it. The ground remembers in ways the stone cannot. It holds particles too small to see. It holds elements no ancient hand deposited there. It holds sometimes a thin dark line drawn across the strata, a horizon of altered chemistry that marks the exact instant at which one kind of world ended and another began. To find such a line, one must know how to look for it, and it is here, at this threshold, that the inquiry changes character. It stops being an act of standing on hilltops and running one's fingers over glassy stone. It becomes something else, patient, laboratory-bound, mineralogical. It becomes a matter of tweezers and centrifuges, of magnetic separations and electron microscopes, of grains of quartz turned edge-on beneath polarized light. The archaeologist in this new mode is a kind of forensic pathologist of landscapes, working long after the body has cooled. Consider what such a pathologist looks for. There is first the shocked quartz, a mineral so common in the Earth's crust as to be almost trivial, and yet, when subjected to sudden and extraordinary pressures, transformed into something diagnostic. Ordinary quartz fractures along familiar planes. Shocked quartz, by contrast, carries within it what mineralogists describe as planar deformation features, sets of parallel lamellae running through the crystal, sometimes filled with glass, evidence that for a single instant the atomic lattice was compressed and heated far beyond anything geology alone can accomplish. Such features are the calling card of impact events. They occur, so far as we know, in only two natural contexts: beneath meteorite craters and along the paths of nuclear detonations. They are not produced by wildfire. They are not produced by volcanic activity, at least not in the configurations that impact researchers have learned to recognize. And when they appear in a horizon of destruction at an archaeological site, they raise a question that no ordinary siege or accidental blaze can readily answer. There is, second, the cosmic spherule, a tiny bead, often smaller than a grain of sand, formed when molten material is flung into the air and cools into a droplet before it lands. Some spherules are iron-rich, dark, magnetic, betraying their extraterrestrial origins by the elemental fingerprint of their alloy. Others are silica-rich, glassy, translucent, sometimes even hollow. All share the same essential biography: a moment of melting, a moment of flight, a moment of solidification, all compressed into the fraction of a second in which a fireball travels through cold air. Cosmic spherules of one kind or another have been raining down on the Earth for as long as the Earth has had an atmosphere. But their concentration in a given layer, their morphology, their chemistry, these can betray a moment when a great deal more than the ordinary background flux passed through the sky. There is, third, the platinum group anomaly: platinum, iridium, osmium, rhodium, ruthenium. These are among the rarest elements at the Earth's surface. Long ago, when our planet was still molten, they sank with iron into the core, leaving the crust depleted of them by orders of magnitude. Certain kinds of extraterrestrial material, however, chondritic meteorites in particular, carry these elements in far greater abundance. A sudden enrichment of platinum or of iridium in a discrete stratigraphic layer is therefore something like a chemical bruise, a mark left where something from beyond the atmosphere touched the ground. It was such an anomaly at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene that first alerted Lewis and Walter Alvarez in 1980 to the possibility that a great impact had ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs, a hypothesis at the time as heretical as any we have yet encountered, and one now so thoroughly vindicated that it appears in every schoolchild's textbook. Platinum, iridium. These are what one looks for when one suspects that the sky itself has left a residue in the earth. And there is, fourth, the nanodiamond. Microscopic in the truest sense, invisible even under ordinary microscopes, discernible only by the specialized techniques of transmission electron microscopy, these are diamonds of a particular structural family, hexagonal lonsdolite, cubic nanodiamonds of the sort that form when carbon is subjected to sudden shock and rapid quenching. They are not the diamonds of jewelers. They are far too small ever to see with the naked eye, and they exist in concentrations that must be measured in parts per million or less. But their presence in a given horizon is difficult to explain by any process gentler than an impact scale shock. Where nanodiamonds cluster in the strata, so the argument runs, there something extraordinary once occurred. Assemble these markers together, the shocked quartz, the spherules, the platinum group anomalies, the nanodiamonds, and one has what those working in the field describe as a suite of proxies. No single marker, on its own, closes the case. Each can, in isolation, be explained by ordinary terrestrial processes. Each has its critics and its alternative interpretations. Each is a whisper rather than a shout. But their combined presence, in the same layer, in the same site, at the same moment in the stratigraphic record, is what proponents argue tips the balance. A single fingerprint, they suggest, is ambiguous. 4 fingerprints, at the same location, in the same instant, are much harder to dismiss. Among those who have argued this case most persistently, one name recurs across the literature. Dr. Wendy Wolbach, geochemist at DePaul University in Chicago, has spent much of her career working on the chemical signatures of catastrophic events in the sedimentary record. She has contributed to the body of research surrounding the Younger Dryas boundary, examining the carbon-rich horizon itself and the microscopic markers it contains, working through the painstaking laboratory analyses that transform a handful of soil into a testable claim. Her contention, and the contention of her collaborators, is that the same fingerprints identified at the Younger Dryas boundary, the same suite of proxies argued to record a hemispheric aerial event nearly 13 millennia ago, have also been found at certain Bronze Age destruction sites, not universally, not without controversy, not in every ruined city or every burned tell, but at particular sites, in particular layers, the pattern seems to repeat. Melted pottery, fused mud brick, minerals whose formation would have required temperatures far in excess of anything an ancient hearth or an invading army could plausibly generate. And with these macroscopic anomalies, the microscopic ones, the same spherules, the same shocked minerals, the same elemental enrichments that mark the deeper horizon at the edge of the Ice Age. The scientific community, it must be said plainly, is divided on the meaning of these findings. Proponents maintain that the markers, taken together, constitute robust evidence for catastrophic airbursts distributed across time, striking here and there across the millennia in a manner statistically consistent with what we know of the near-Earth object population. Critics contend that the markers are not uniquely diagnostic of impacts, that some can be produced by wildfire or by industrial contamination, or by ordinary volcanic processes, that laboratories have not always agreed on identifications, that stratigraphic contexts have been misread. Papers have been published, and papers have been challenged. Some studies have been retracted. Some have been reanalyzed. The debate is live, and at times it has been unusually acrimonious, with charges of methodological carelessness answered by countercharges of dogmatic resistance. Dr. James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, another figure who recurs in this literature, has emphasized a particular subtlety that bears on the whole inquiry. Not every airburst, he has observed, behaves like a textbook impact. What Kennett and his collaborators describe as touchdown events, where the thermal and pressure pulse of an aerial detonation reaches close enough to the ground to inflict extreme damage without a body of solid material excavating a bowl in the earth, can, in his phrasing, cause extreme damage through very high temperatures and pressures, and yet leave behind ephemeral surface disturbances rather than the classic circular crater that popular imagination associates with impacts. The absence of a crater, in other words, is not the absence of an event. It is, on this reading, a particular signature of a particular kind of event. If this is true, and here we are still honestly in the realm of the contested, then the detective's toolkit begins to look rather different from the one an earlier generation of impact scientists carried. One does not, on this account, go searching for the great scar in the ground. One goes searching for the altered chemistry of the surface. One takes samples from the destruction layer of a ruined settlement and hands them to a geochemist, and one waits to see what the electron microscope has to say. The evidence one seeks is small, patient, and quiet. It is a matter of parts per million and grains per gram. But if the markers cluster where the ordinary explanations falter, if the melted stones and the fused bricks and the vitrified ramparts we've already met are accompanied, in the soil beneath them, by the whispered chemistry of a thermal pulse from above, then the case, without ever becoming certain, begins to look strikingly different from anything a besieging army or an accidental hearth could account for. And it is here, at the meeting of the toolkit and the ruin, that we come to what may be, in all this inquiry, the single most extraordinary site so far identified. Its name is Tel Abu Huraira. It lies in the upper Euphrates Valley in Syria, or rather it lay there, because it is now beneath the waters of Lake Assad, the great artificial reservoir created by the Tabqa Dam. The site was excavated in the early 1970s, in the brief window between the announcement of the dam project and the flooding of the valley, by a team led by Andrew Moore. It was, in archaeological terms, a mound of the sort that dot the Near East by the thousand, a tell, built up over millennia as successive generations lived, died, and dropped their debris one atop another. But this particular tell held something unusual. It preserved, within its stratigraphy, one of the clearest records anywhere on Earth of the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. Its lower levels were Natufian, dating to the time when Ice Age foragers were beginning to settle into permanent villages, still living from wild plants and wild game. Its upper levels were early Neolithic, and by then the people of Abu Huraira had begun to cultivate cereals and pulses, to keep animals, to build in a manner that anticipated the great agricultural civilizations to come. Between the two lay one of the most consequential thresholds in the human story, the moment at which our species began, in a modest riverine village in Syria, to become something other than what it had been for all the ages before. Between the two lay something else too. In 2020, half a century after the site was excavated and drowned, a paper appeared in the journal Scientific Reports, authored by Andrew Moore, the original excavator, and by James Kennett, and by a substantial team of collaborators. Its subject was a particular layer within the Abu Huraira sequence, a layer that had been sampled and archived in the 1970s and had waited for decades for techniques of analysis that had not existed when it was collected. The layer dated, according to the paper's authors, to approximately 12,800 years ago. It lay, in other words, at exactly the horizon of the Younger Dryas boundary, and what Moore and Kennett and their colleagues reported finding within it was arresting. They reported melt glass, They reported it not in isolated pockets, but splashed across a range of materials from the occupation layer, across fragments of building material, across bones, across tools. They reported microspherules. They reported nanodiamonds, and among them cubic diamonds of the sort associated with high-shock events. And when they modelled through the mineralogy of the melt glass itself, the temperature required to produce what they were seeing, the fusion of these particular substances into these particular structures, the number they arrived at was staggering. Over 2,200 degrees Celsius, higher in that particular respect than the surface fireball of a nuclear detonation, high enough to melt not merely stone or brick but iron and steel, high enough, in the words of James Kennett quoted at the time of the paper's release, to completely melt an automobile in less than a minute. And the melt glass, on the evidence of its microstructure, had formed in less than a second. Not sustained heating over hours, not the slow burn of a village catching fire, a pulse, a single, blinding, near instantaneous surge of thermal energy from above, come and gone before anyone in the village could have understood what was happening to them. The paper described this signature as a smoking gun for a localized airburst, a fragment, perhaps, of the fragmented body whose broader signature, on the hypothesis, defines the younger Dryas boundary itself. Not necessarily a direct impact, in the sense of a body striking the surface, but an aerial detonation of the sort that Tunguska has taught us to recognize, close enough to the settlement that its thermal pulse licked down and turned an early Neolithic village to slag. And it is here that one must pause and try, however imperfectly, to imagine what such a moment must have been. A morning at Abu Huraira, the Euphrates running by, smoke rising from cook fires, people stepping out of their dwellings to work the fields they had only lately learned to work. Then, without warning, without any prelude that surviving oral tradition could ever have preserved because no one survived to preserve it, a light in the sky, and, in an interval too brief for consciousness to register, the world becomes fire. The buildings do not burn in the ordinary sense of the word. They are not consumed by flame. They are instead in an instant transmuted. Glass welded to bone, stone splashed like water, the substance of an entire settled place, rewritten at the molecular level by a pulse of heat descending from above. Whether this reconstruction is correct, of course, is precisely what the ongoing debate concerns. Abu Huraira has not been immune from the wider controversy surrounding the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Critics have raised, as they have raised elsewhere, questions about the interpretation of the markers, about the calibration of the temperatures, about the possibility that the melt glass was formed by some more prosaic process that has yet to be adequately considered. Proponents have responded. The literature continues to accumulate. But what cannot be seriously disputed is the physical reality of the melt glass itself. It exists. It was collected. It has been analysed. It is, as of the writing of the Moore and Kennett paper, the only known human settlement demonstrably linked to a high-temperature, impact-related destruction event of this specific character, a village whose end appears to have come quite literally from the sky, and whose remains, preserved beneath the waters of Lake Assad, constitute the most direct testimony we possess that such things have happened, at least once, within the range of the human story. And if they have happened once, one is left to wonder, and it is here that the earlier sites begin to press themselves back into mind, whether they might not have happened more than once, whether at other tells and other ruined mounds and other capitals whose destruction has been variously attributed to earthquake or invader or accident of hearth, the melt glass might not still be waiting, unstudied, in some archived box on some laboratory shelf, for the techniques and the questions to come round to it at last. There is one further site that must be introduced before we begin to draw the threads together, and it is a site whose case has been, if anything, more publicly contested than that of Abu Huraira itself. Its name is Tal el-Hammam, and it lies in the southern Jordan Valley, on the northeastern side of the Dead Sea Plain. Tal el-Hammam was, in its heyday, one of the largest urban centres in the region, a Middle Bronze Age city of considerable size, walled, well-populated, integrated into the trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then, around the middle of the 17th century before the Common Era, it stopped being a city at all. Its destruction was total. Its walls came down, its buildings burned, and where cities in the ancient Near East typically rise again from their ashes within a generation or two, where the destruction of a settlement is almost never the end of settlement on the same spot, Tal el-Hammam was not rebuilt. The site was effectively abandoned for centuries thereafter. Something happened at Tal el-Hammam around 1650 BCE that was not merely a defeat or a fire, but a discontinuity, a break so severe that the human presence there simply ceased. The excavations at Tal el-Hammam have been directed by the archaeologist Stephen Collins, and in 2021 he and a substantial geoscience team published, in Scientific Reports, a paper making a very specific claim about the nature of the discontinuity. Within the destruction layer at the site, a horizon roughly 1.5 meters in thickness, filled with the debris of the city's ending, they reported having identified the now familiar suite of markers: shocked quartz, cosmic spherules, melted pottery, melted mud brick. Minerals whose formation, on their analysis, required temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Celsius. And they reported something further, something suggestive in its own particular way, a directionality to the destruction, a pattern of debris dispersal running from the southwest toward the northeast, as though the city had been struck not by a fire welling up from within, but by a blast wave sweeping in from a particular quarter of the sky. The event they proposed was of the same essential character as the Tunguska explosion of 1908, but at somewhat closer quarters, a cosmic airburst whose thermal pulse and blast wave had, between them, obliterated the city in a matter of seconds. The proposal attracted, as such proposals do, immediate attention beyond the specialist literature. Tal el-Hammam lies within the geographical range and roughly within the chronological range associated with the biblical account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that narrative from the book of Genesis of cities consumed by fire from heaven. Whether or not one takes that ancient text as historical testimony, the coincidence of a documented Bronze Age city destroyed by intense heat in the plain of the Jordan Valley with a much later religious tradition remembering fire from the sky in the same general region is the sort of coincidence that inevitably draws comment. The paper's authors, to their credit, treated the parallel carefully, noting that the destruction of Tal el-Hammam might have contributed, over centuries of oral transmission, to the later narrative, without insisting that the site was Sodom or that the biblical account should be read as anything other than what it is on its own terms. But the parallel once raised would not be put down again. Nor would the critics stay silent. The Tal el-Hammam paper, from the moment of its publication, was subjected to a wave of scrutiny that in some cases approached the ferocious. Geologists and physicists questioned the identification of the shocked quartz. They challenged the interpretations of the spheruleal chemistry. They raised concerns about the methodology by which temperatures had been inferred, and about the possibility that the association with the Sodom narrative had, however inadvertently, shaped the framing of the evidence. The physicist Mark Boslow, a leading authority on airburst modelling and a long-standing skeptic of what he regards as insufficiently supported impact claims, argued that the extraordinary nature of the proposal demanded, in his phrasing, the highest burdens of evidence. burdens that in his view had not been met. The debate ran on. Papers were published in response, corrections and clarifications appeared, and in April 2025 the journal in which the original paper had appeared took the significant step of retracting it, citing the accumulated technical critiques and unresolved concerns raised by outside specialists. That retraction, one must be careful to note, does not settle the question. A retraction, in the culture of scientific publishing, is a serious event, but it is not identical to a refutation. It records that the journal's editors, having reviewed the objections raised, no longer regard the paper as meeting their standards for the specific claims it advanced. It does not, of itself, prove that Tall el-Hammam was not destroyed by an airburst, any more than the original publication proved that it was. What remains after the retraction is the physical evidence at the site. The destruction layer itself, the melted materials within it, the extreme disarticulation of certain skeletal remains, the century plus of subsequent abandonment. What that evidence means is, at the time this is being written, unresolved. Proponents continue to argue that no ordinary conflagration and no ordinary siege can account for what the layer contains. Critics continue to argue that ordinary processes properly considered are sufficient. The scientific community, on this specific site as on the wider hypothesis, remains deeply divided, and so we are left with two cases sitting side by side at very different moments in the human story. Abu Huraira, at the boundary of the Ice Age, at the birth of agriculture, drowned now beneath a reservoir but preserving in its archived samples a fingerprint that its authors describe as a smoking gun. Tall el-Hammam, deep in the Bronze Age, in the plain of the Jordan Valley, its destruction layer visible still to any visitor with the patience to descend into the trench, its interpretation contested to the point of formal retraction, and beyond. Two sites, two moments, two claims, and between them the outlines of a methodology, a way of reading the soil that is only now beginning to be applied systematically to the wider catalogue of anomalously heated ruins that this inquiry has assembled. What might such a methodology find, one begins to wonder, if it were turned in earnest on the vitrified ramparts of Scotland, on the fused bricks of Mohenjo-Daro, on the glazed limestone of the Hittite gateway? What might the electron microscope have to say about the melt patches of Sacsayhuaman, or about the sands beyond the Libyan glass field? What would we see if we finally looked? To ask such a question is to feel the ground shift beneath one's feet. For if the methodology is real, and if the proxies are meaningful, and if even a fraction of the anomalous heat signatures assembled so far belong to the same family of events, then what has been treated for a century and more as a scatter of unrelated local puzzles must be reconsidered as something else entirely. Not a coincidence, not a series of independent industrial accidents, or destructive sieges, or unusually hot pyres. A pattern, and a pattern in this domain is a very different creature from a curiosity. It has a shape, it has a distribution, it has potentially a cause. Consider what happens if one lays out, on a single map of the world, every location so far named in this inquiry. Begin in the north, in the granitic uplands of Aberdeenshire, and mark Tapper North, and then, radiating outward across the Highlands and the western coasts, the 60 or 70 other Scottish forts whose ramparts have been fused. Cross the Atlantic and set a point high in the Andes, at Sacsayhuaman, above Cusco, and another beside the pale altiplano waters of Titicaca, at Pumapunku. Turn eastward, over the ocean, and drop a mark at Mohenjo-Daro in the plain of the lower Indus. Move up and to the west, through the mountains of the Zagros, and place another at Hattusa on its Anatolian ridge, sweep south into the Great Sand Sea between Egypt and Libya, and shade in the 800 kilometers and more across which the silica glass is scattered. Return northeast to the upper Euphrates and mark the drowned mound of Abu Huraira. Come down the Levantine corridor and set a point on the northeastern shore of the Dead Sea at Tall El Hammam. Then add the sites that have, until now, sat quietly at the edges of the discussion. In the sands of the Ruba al-Khali in Saudi Arabia, the Wabar craters, small, well-documented impact scars, their rims lined with black and green glass produced when an iron meteorite struck the desert floor and drove its energy into the silicates below. Along the escarpments and playas of the Dakhla oasis in Egypt's western desert, another glass field entirely, silica glass of a different chemistry from the Libyan sheet, dated, on current readings, to something in the order of 145,000 years before the present, with no accompanying crater, and with a distribution that suggests once again an aerial thermal event rather than a ground impact. In the plains of the Northern Territory and Queensland, the tektites associated with the Tenom meteorite fall, and the deeper, older Australian tektite fields, glassy droplets whose composition speaks unambiguously to melting at hypervelocity. And through Southeast Asia, from Thailand into Laos and Cambodia and southern China, the Mong Nong tektites, layered and blocky, some of them large enough to hold in two hands, the debris of a monstrous impact event that has left every field geologist who has worked on it convinced that a great deal of terrestrial surface somewhere once flashed instantaneously into vapour. Now stand back from the map. What does one see? One sees a planet marked, at many latitudes and in many climates, by high-temperature surface events. One sees points that cluster, in some regions, along corridors, the Levantine bridge from the Jordan Valley up through Anatolia, the belt across the Sahara from the Libyan sheet to the Dakhla field to the Wabar craters, the Andean spine, the North Atlantic archipelago, the Indo-Iranian plateau, the great East Asian tektite strewn field. One sees, within certain time windows, a suspicious density: the terminal Pleistocene, the mid-Holocene, the late Bronze Age, and one sees, at each individual point, evidence of temperatures that ordinary human fires, in the periods concerned, are hard-pressed to produce. Not a single anomaly, not two, not five, a global signature. That is not a proof of any particular cause. It is not in itself an argument that all of these sites belong to a single class of event, or that any of them are connected to any other. Wabar and the Libyan sheet are separated by an ocean of time and mechanism from a hill fort in Aberdeenshire. Mong Nong tektites, whatever their strewn geography, are unlikely to have anything in common with the melted joints of an Inca wall. To collapse the entire catalogue into a single explanation would be to fall exactly into the interpretive trap that this inquiry has been trying to avoid. And yet, and here is the pressure that the map exerts once one has drawn it, the cumulative impression is not nothing. It is not neutral. It is an impression of a planet that has been struck, and struck again, and struck yet again, across geological and historical time, by concentrations of heat that the ordinary chemistry of the ground does not easily produce. Some of those strikes are unambiguously extraterrestrial. The Wabar craters wear their meteoritic origin on their sleeves. Some are unambiguously terrestrial and industrial. A slag heap outside a Bronze Age foundry can, under the right conditions, produce something that looks, to the untrained eye, disquietingly like impactite. And a great many in the middle remain genuinely uncertain, their assignment to one bin or the other depending on which specialist one asks, and on which sample one submits, and on which set of proxies one privileges. As the geologist Robert Schoch, who has written at length on vitrified sites and on their thermal requirements, has put it in simple summary, temperatures of 1,000 degrees centigrade are required to vitrify rock. That threshold is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what at each site delivered that temperature, and whether some subset of the sites required something more than 1,000 degrees, required indeed 2,000 or 3,000, and whether the mechanism that supplied it was human or geological or something that came, however rarely, from the sky. The map does not answer these questions, it merely refuses to let them be asked one at a time, and it is precisely because the map is so provocative that the second and equally necessary part of this reckoning must now be conducted, for it would be a betrayal of the inquiry itself and of the audience it addresses to allow the accumulating suggestion of a global pattern to harden into a conclusion before the strongest objections to that conclusion have been placed in the open air. The case against the catastrophist reading of these sites is not weak, it is not fringe. It is in fact the mainstream position across archaeology and planetary science, and it is defended by researchers whose credentials and whose command of the evidence are formidable. To hear their objections properly is not a concession. It is a condition of taking the question seriously at all. The most sustained critique has been directed at the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, whose fingerprints, if they are fingerprints, form the interpretive backbone of much that has been argued in the preceding sections. In 2011, the geoarchaeologist Nicholas Pinter, together with a group of co-authors, published what he and they explicitly called a requiem for the hypothesis, a phrase that captures, with some economy, the confidence of the dismissal. Their case, laid out in detail, rested on several distinct objections. The proxies claimed to be unique to the Younger Dryas boundary layer, they argued, were not in fact unique. Nanodiamonds occur in a range of terrestrial contexts, not all of them cosmic. Cosmic spherules, once one begins looking for them systematically, appear in sediments from many periods and many places, because the Earth is, and always has been, under a continuous rain of micrometeoritic material. Platinum group anomalies, they suggested, could be explained without invoking a fragmented comet, and perhaps most damagingly they argued the independent replication of the original findings had, in a significant number of cases, failed. Where one team reported a spike, another, working on the same or comparable material, did not. Where one laboratory identified impact spherules, another, applying its own protocols, identified terrestrial byproducts of fire or industry or biology. The signal, they contended, was not consistent. It was patchy. And a patchy signal, in geology as in medicine, is generally the fingerprint of a heterogeneous set of causes rather than a single global one. The geoarchaeologist Vance Holliday, working in parallel with and sometimes in concert with these arguments, has made the further and in some ways more fundamental point that the stratigraphy claimed for the Younger Dryas boundary is, when examined across sites, not as coherent as its proponents suggest. For a single global event to be inferred from a proxy layer, that layer must appear at the correct depth, in the correct age relation, at every locality where the event's effects are claimed. Holliday's argument, as one understands it from his published work, has been that the sites do not in fact meet this standard. At some, the horizon is present. At others, it is absent, or displaced, or of ambiguous age. At others still, the samples that yielded the anomalous readings turn out, on closer inspection, to have come from sediments that cannot be securely tied to the boundary itself. If this is right, and one must be candid that these are difficult judgments, requiring detailed familiarity with the specific stratigraphies of many separate excavations, then the case for a single event, striking many places simultaneously 12,800 years ago, is very substantially weakened. The argument extends with modifications to the vitrified sites themselves. Where the catastrophist reading proposes an aerial thermal event as the cause of the fused ramparts of Scotland, the mainstream reply is that experimental archaeology, whatever its shortcomings, has demonstrated a plausible terrestrial route to the necessary temperatures. Burning a timber-laced rampart under the right conditions of fuel loading and airflow and duration can, in principle, reach the vicinity of 1100 degrees centigrade, which is at the lower end of the vitrification range. The failure of Child and Thornycroft, and later of Ralston, to achieve full structural vitrification does not, in this view, disprove the mechanism. It merely shows that the conditions are difficult to reproduce, either because the ancient builders knew something about fuel and geometry that modern experimenters have not recovered, or because the events were rare and required unusual circumstances of wind and moisture and combustible mass. The archaeologist Andy Heald, who has worked on Scottish material, has observed that even within the mainstream frame, real questions persist about the meaning of the vitrification, whether it was, as some have suggested, a status marker deliberately produced, or whether it was the result of hostile burning by attackers who wished to render the fort permanently uninhabitable. These are live debates, but they are debates conducted on the mainstream view entirely within the space of ordinary human agency and ordinary combustion, without any need to invoke the sky. Similar arguments apply to the other sites. Metallurgical waste, the slag produced by ancient smelting operations, particularly where copper and tin and iron were being worked at high temperatures, can, under some conditions, produce vitreous residues whose appearance and even whose bulk chemistry can superficially resemble impact glass. Deliberate large-scale burning, whether ritual or destructive, can raise local temperatures well above what a domestic hearth or an ordinary house fire would produce. In a well-studied cremation pyre, or in the deliberate torching of a granary rich in oils, temperatures approaching 1,000 degrees are not physically impossible. Add to these the possibility in some cases of lightning strikes producing fulgurites and small localized melt features, and the mainstream case is that the catalogue of anomalous heat can be almost entirely absorbed into known and unremarkable processes, provided one is willing to allow that many separate processes at many separate sites have conspired to leave a superficially unified impression. The critics point, moreover, to the absence of the one thing that would settle the matter beyond argument: an unambiguous impact crater, or a set of them, dated to the periods in question and located near enough to the affected sites to have plausibly delivered the observed effects. Wabar has such a crater. So does Meteor Crater in Arizona. So do the confirmed impact structures of the deep geological record. But for the Younger Dryas hypothesis, no such crater has been securely identified. The Hiawatha structure beneath the Greenland ice, once put forward as a candidate, has more recently been dated to a period tens of millions of years older than the Younger Dryas boundary. For Tall El Hammam, no crater has been located. For the Libyan sheet, the debate over crater versus airburst remains, as the previous sections have discussed, unresolved. The critic's point is not merely that craters are missing here or there, it is that the pattern of missing craters is exactly what one would expect if the underlying phenomenon were, in most cases, not extraterrestrial at all. Held together, these objections form a serious and coherent counterposition. The purported markers of impact, the critics say, are not unique. The stratigraphy is not consistent. The vitrification is reproducible in principle by ordinary means. The craters are absent where they should be present. And the temptation to link disparate sites into a single narrative is, in this view, a well-known failure mode of interdisciplinary inquiry. the imposition of a satisfying pattern on data that, examined more carefully and more locally, resolves into ordinary local causes. One does not have to accept every element of this critique to feel its weight, and any honest engagement with the evidence must acknowledge that, at the present moment, the mainstream scientific consensus does not endorse the catastrophist reading of any of the sites this inquiry has assembled, with the sole and unambiguous exception of those like Wabar, whose meteoritic origin is not in dispute. And yet the mystery so acknowledged does not dissolve, it reshapes itself. The critics have not shown that the anomalous heat is absent. They have shown that its causes are contested, and that some ordinary causes cannot yet be ruled out. The critics have not shown that ancient fires can reach the highest temperatures documented in some of the samples. They have shown that ancient fires can, under favourable conditions, reach the lower end of the vitrification band. The critics have not shown that no low-altitude airburst has ever affected an inhabited site. They have shown that the specific claims made for specific sites have not, in their view, met the evidentiary bar. That is a very different thing from a refutation, and it leaves the physical evidence, the fused ramparts, the slagged mud brick, the melted joints, the desert glass, sitting on the shelf, awaiting a better account than any of the current parties has yet provided. Into that gap, one particular model has begun to insert itself with increasing precision, and it is a model that, whatever its ultimate fate, deserves to be laid out on its own terms, because it resolves, at least in principle, the central physical paradox that has haunted this inquiry from the beginning. If the temperatures required to vitrify stone lie in the range of 1000 to 1300 degrees centigrade for the ordinary hill fort case, and rise into the range of 1800, 2000 or higher for the melt glass of the desert and the Bronze Age destruction layers, and if no sustained ancient fire has ever been convincingly shown to reach and hold such temperatures over the necessary volumes of stone, then how physically might such heating occur? Where, in the natural repertoire of the atmosphere, is a mechanism to be found that can deliver such energies to a surface, briefly, from above? The answer that has emerged from a body of computational and experimental work over the last 2 decades is the low-altitude thermal pulse. And the researcher whose work has done most to develop it is the physicist Mark Boslow of Sandia National Laboratories, the same figure whose skepticism of the Tall El Hammam interpretation was noted earlier. A reminder, if one were needed, that a researcher can advance a mechanism in general while doubting its application to particular cases. Boslow's simulations, initially of the Tunguska event and later, with much greater resolution, of the Chelyabinsk airburst of February 2013, have shown that a sufficiently large bolide entering the atmosphere at hypervelocity does not, in the strict sense, explode. What happens is more strange and more consequential. As the object descends, its leading face is subjected to enormous ram pressures. The air ahead of it is compressed and heated to temperatures at which it becomes a plasma. The projectile itself begins to ablate and, above a critical threshold of size and velocity, to disintegrate. What is generated is not a single point source detonation but a jet, a downward directed plume of vaporized projectile material, entrained air and radiant energy, traveling at supersonic speeds toward the ground. If the kinetic energy of the object exceeds a specific threshold, this jet does not dissipate at altitude in the way that a traditional nuclear-style fireball, expanding spherically from a stationary point, would do. Instead, it maintains its downward coherence. It couples directly to the surface, and it delivers, in the brief interval during which the coupling persists, a pulse of radiant energy in the infrared and visible spectrum whose surface flux is measured not in the units of ordinary combustion, but in the units of stellar physics. The consequences at ground level are peculiar. The pressure wave, when it arrives, is destructive in the ordinary sense. Trees felled, structures collapsed, glass shattered, precisely as at Tunguska in 1908. But the pressure wave is not the first thing to arrive. What arrives first, in the milliseconds before the mechanical disturbance reaches the ground, is the light. A brief, blinding, high-temperature flash, delivered not as a diffuse glow, but as a concentrated column of radiant energy from a specific quadrant of the sky. Under such a flash, exposed surfaces are heated with extraordinary rapidity. Silicate stone, whose melting point sits in the range this inquiry has repeatedly cited, receives, in the space of a single second or a fraction of one, a dose of energy sufficient to raise its outer skin a millimeter, a centimeter, in some scenarios more, to 1200, 1500, 2000 degrees. And then, as suddenly as it came, the pulse is gone. The surface, briefly molten, begins to cool. It does not have time to conduct its heat deeply into the mass of the stone. The interior remains relatively cold. What congeals, in the moments that follow, is a glassy skin over an ordinary rock, a vitrified rampart, a fused brick, a melt patch on a dressed limestone joint. This is the resolution of the paradox that has run beneath every case so far examined. One does not need a sustained fire to vitrify stone. One does not need a special fuel or a lost pyrotechnical technique or a metallurgical accident on an inconceivable scale. One needs, and one needs only, one extraordinary second of concentrated radiant energy delivered from above. The physics does not require the event to be common. It requires the event to be, on the occasions when it occurs, of sufficient magnitude. An object large enough, entering fast enough, at an altitude low enough for the thermal jet to couple to the ground rather than dispersing in the upper atmosphere. Such events, on the current understanding, are rare, but they are not fantastically rare. Chelyabinsk on February 15, 2013, gave the world a small-scale demonstration, an object perhaps 20 meters across, releasing energy equivalent to several hundred kilotons of TNT, producing thermal effects sufficient to raise skin temperatures kilometers from the trajectory. A larger object, at lower altitude, over a Bronze Age plain or an Iron Age hilltop, would deliver correspondingly more. The precise energy thresholds at which the coupled jet regime engages and the precise scaling of surface temperature with bolide size and velocity and altitude remain matters of active research. Boslow and others continue to refine the simulations. There is genuine debate about whether the pulse can, in every scenario proposed for it, reach the temperatures required for the most extreme glasses. There are questions about the geometry of shadowing, why, on some vitrified walls, the melt pattern respects certain faces and spares others, a pattern one might expect from a directional flash, but one that has not been systematically mapped across the global catalogue. There are questions about how the model, so cleanly stated for an idealized hilltop, applies to a walled city, a rock-cut gateway, an urban brick surface partially shielded by neighbouring structures. These are not fatal questions. They are the ordinary refinements that any young mechanism attracts as it moves from the whiteboard into the field. What the thermal pulse model provides, then, is not a proof that any specific vitrified site was caused by an airburst. It provides rather something more fundamental, a physically plausible route by which such vitrification could in principle occur without requiring any suspension of the known laws of combustion, materials science, or fluid dynamics. It converts the question from one of possibility to one of evidence, and it invites, urgently, the systematic application of the proxy toolkit developed at Abu Huraira and, controversially, at Tall El Hammam to the wider catalogue. Because if such a mechanism exists, and the Chelyabinsk footage, and the Tunguska record, and the Waba craters, and the supercomputer simulations all agree that it does, then the only remaining question at each of the anomalous sites is whether it left its fingerprint there or whether some more ordinary process did the work instead. And it is that question, at last, that the closing arc of this inquiry must be prepared to face. Not the question of whether vitrification is possible, for the map has shown that it is real and that it is global. Not the question of whether an airburst can vitrify a wall, for the physics has shown that it can. But the question, harder and slower and more patient, of how often such events occur, of what the human memory of them might look like if any such memory survives, and of what, if anything, the accumulated evidence permits us to say about the past and about the sky above us, which is not so empty and not so quiet as the daylight makes it seem. That question of frequency is where the inquiry becomes something more than archaeology, more than geology, more than the careful examination of melted rock and fractured crystal. It becomes, quite suddenly and with a quiet chill, a question about the present, about this sky, this century, this civilization sitting beneath a field of debris it has only recently begun to take seriously. The men who first confronted that question most directly were not archaeologists, they were astronomers, observers of the sky's long behaviour rather than its surface residue. Victor Klube, an astrophysicist based at Oxford, and Bill Napier, an astronomer whose work spanned decades of orbital mechanics and solar system dynamics, arrived at a framework so unsettling that it took years for mainstream science even to grant it the dignity of sustained debate. They called it coherent catastrophism. The name is precise, and deliberately so. Not random catastrophism, the idea that the cosmos occasionally delivers a rogue impact with no pattern and no warning, but coherent catastrophism, a model in which Earth's encounters with destructive cosmic events are structured, periodic, and in some measure predictable. Their seminal work, The Cosmic Serpent, published in 1982, laid out the mechanism with a clarity that should have ignited immediate alarm. Instead, it entered the literature quietly, cited by specialists, disputed by others, and largely ignored by the wider culture for decades. The argument begins with the Taurid meteor stream, a broad river of cometary debris spread along an orbital highway that Earth crosses twice yearly, in late June and again in late October and early November. The Taurids are familiar to anyone who has watched the autumn sky. Modest, slow-moving meteors arcing overhead in gentle numbers, appearing harmless, even beautiful. But Klube and Napier pointed to something far more unsettling beneath that familiar appearance. The stream, they argued, is not merely a river of dust. It is the dispersed remnant of an extraordinarily massive comet, a body perhaps hundreds of kilometers across, that entered the inner solar system within the last 20,000 years and has been fragmenting ever since, shedding boulders and bolides and objects large enough to level cities along a path that intersects Earth's own orbit with metronomic regularity. The progenitor comet, unnamed, inferred rather than directly observed, would dwarf anything in the current catalogue of known near-Earth objects. As it decays, it does not vanish cleanly, it breaks apart. It seeds the stream with pieces of every size, harmless grains that flare briefly as shooting stars, meter-scale fragments that enter the atmosphere and discharge in the upper sky, 100-meter boulders that carry enough energy to equal nuclear detonations, and rare kilometer-scale pieces whose encounters with Earth would constitute events of geological consequence. At any given time, the stream contains this full range. The question is not whether dangerous objects lurk within it. The question is how densely they are concentrated, and when Earth passes through the densest regions. Klube and Napier's answer, developed over years of orbital calculation and refined through subsequent papers, was that the distribution of debris within the stream is not uniform. It is clumped. Dense nodes and tendrils wind through the broader current, and Earth's orbital mechanics bring it into contact with these concentrations on timescales of centuries to millennia, intervals short enough to fall within the span of civilizational memory, long enough to slip between the documented chapters of any single culture's history. Their modelling suggested that the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age corresponded to one such period of heightened passage, a time when Earth moved through regions of the stream where large fragments were more numerous, when the statistical frequency of high-energy airbursts above populated landscapes was measurably elevated. A window of time, in other words, when the sky above civilizations that possessed no orbital tracking, no planetary defense coordination, no means of knowing what moved through the dark above their fires, carried a statistically heightened probability of catastrophic encounter. Within that window, humanity built its most enduring monuments, raised its most sophisticated cities, and inscribed its terrors onto stone and clay and oral tradition. And across that same window, the geochemical record, quietly, stubbornly, without editorial comment, preserves the signatures of temperatures that no ancient hearth, no ritual pyre, no siege fire could produce. The stone, silent and patient and utterly indifferent to the theories we have built around it, holds both the evidence and the question in the same fused glassy surface. Now, having traced the path from a single hill fort in Aberdeenshire to the Libyan desert, to the walls of a ruined Hittite capital, to the Altiplano of Peru, and back again through the long atmospheric physics of shock waves and plasma jets and orbital mechanics, it becomes possible, for the first time in this inquiry, to stand back and look at the whole, not the fragment, not the anomalous heat signature at a single site, not the contested proxy suite from a single paper, not the argument between a volcanologist and an experimental archaeologist over a wall that should not have melted, the whole. And what the whole reveals is not chaos. It reveals something far more unsettling. It reveals a pattern. 3 windows in time emerge from the accumulated evidence, stripped of disciplinary partitioning, and placed beside one another as they have never quite been placed before. 3 periods separated by millennia, during which the intersection of Earth's orbital path with the densest regions of the torrid stream appears to have elevated the frequency of high-energy atmospheric events to a level that left permanent measurable signatures in the geological and archaeological record. Each window carries its own fingerprint, its own scatter of proxy evidence, its own constellation of destroyed or anomalously heated sites, its own silence where memory once lived and then was extinguished. Together, they form a timeline of planetary trauma that no single discipline working within its own walls has been positioned to read in full. The earliest of the 3 windows opens approximately 12,900 years ago at the boundary layer,